Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the dim, smoke-choked corners of a place that didn't just exist in the Middle Ages. It thrived in the shadows of every city, the medieval brothel. You've probably imagined it from paintings or stories. Velvet curtains, sultry whispers, women draped in silk and perfume. The real brothel? It reeked of sweat and ale, straw floors soaked in piss, women marked by law with striped cloaks and bells on their hems, so no one mistook them for respectable. It wasn't romance, it was survival. Bodies rented for pennies, shame traded like currency, hypocrisy sold by the candle. This is what it actually looked like inside a medieval brothel. And by the end of tonight, you'll never think of the Middle Ages the same way again. And hey, if you'd like to help keep the lanterns lit around here and support the deeply unsustainable caffeine addiction that fuels these midnight rabbit holes, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link pinned in the comments. No pressure at all, but every cup helps delay the caffeine-induced heart failure we all know is coming. But before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. And drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. You're not in a castle, you're in a brothel. Forget the shining armor. Forget the courtly songs and noble banquets. You've stumbled into the part of medieval life nobody dares stitch into a tapestry, the place whispered about in sermons yet visited anyway under cover of night. Welcome to the red light of the Middle Ages, where sin is sold by the candle and morality bends like cheap timber. You grew up on tales of knights jousting for honor, of maidens rescued from towers, of feasts where goblets overflow with wine. But the truth you face here is less poetic. In any medieval town, you would pass one of these establishments daily, perhaps even slip inside, though you'd never admit it by daylight. Brothels are everywhere, and nowhere at once. Condemned from the pulpit, tolerated by the city, taxed like a bakery, they stand in plain sight, yet remain invisible. Wooden paradoxes of sin and necessity. You don't find brothels on the edge of society. You find them built into it. City councils license them, slot them neatly into districts, just far enough from churches to keep appearances intact. Paris hums with whole streets devoted to them. London tucks them in Southwark across the Thames. Florence folds them into the city's official business. They lurk near riversides, city gates, and cathedral precincts, close enough to tempt, distant enough to preserve the illusion of moral boundaries. The money matters most. Brothels keep restless men from wandering where they shouldn't, or so the officials claim, and every coin that changes hands can be skimmed for taxes. In this world, sin is civic utility. You aren't walking into shadow. You're walking into sanctioned vice. But don't mistake that sanction for respectability. Crossing this threshold means stepping into a social underworld. The women here are tolerated but despised, needed but shunned. You see faces hardened by poverty, by widowhood, by desperation. Others carry the hollow stare of those who were sold, coerced, or trapped. Once inside, none escape the stain. As you sit on a bench, you realize these public women can serve priests, merchants, and nobles by night, yet find themselves unwelcome in pews and markets by day. The same man who rails against fornication on Sunday might pass through this very door on Tuesday, hoping no one recognizes him. You hear the moralists justify your presence. They tell you it's better for lust to be contained within these walls than to spill into the homes of wives and daughters. Or, God forbid, monasteries. Think of it, they say, as a pressure valve for sin. Even St. Augustine warned that without prostitutes, society would collapse under the weight of uncontrolled desire. And so the city pretends this house is a necessary evil. The church thunders against it from the pulpit, then looks the other way when bishops lease out land to brothel keepers for steady income. Hypocrisy doesn't creep here. It sits openly at the table, nodding along with the prayers. Step further in and you see the truth. There are no velvet curtains, no perfumed chambers. What surrounds you is closer to a dingy tavern than any fantasy of luxury. Wooden beams, dirt floors, smoke-blackened walls. The smell assaults you. Sour ale, unwashed flesh, incense burned to mask the stench, but failing miserably. A few rushes scattered on the ground soak up who knows what, wine, urine, or worse. Candles sputter in iron sconces, their shadows leering at you like drunken companions. The benches wobble, the furniture is battered, and upstairs the straw mattresses have hosted more bodies than a battlefield. Yet men keep arriving, coins in hand, shame draped across their shoulders like cloaks. And shame is part of what you purchase here. You aren't only buying sex, you're buying secrecy, indulgence, the thrill of sinning just out of sight of God's watchful eyes. If you are a farmer, this is the taste of freedom your arranged marriage never gave you. If you are a merchant, it is simply a transaction, clean as bread or wool. If you are a priest, and they come here often, you scratch the itch of hypocrisy in the only place you can. Everyone condemns the brothel, but everyone needs it. Without it, desire spills into streets, convents, and alleyways, unraveling the fragile order of the town. The women live in that contradiction every moment. They are necessary but reviled, pursued but excluded. You notice their clothes. Striped cloaks in some towns, bells stitched to hems, colors forbidden to wives. They may walk freely in the streets, but their garments mark them as outcasts. A woman might earn more here in a night than as a laundress in a week, yet the cost is permanent disgrace. A handful scrape together enough coin to buy freedom. A lucky few climb into better trades. But most end their days poor, sick, and scorned, their labor keeping households safe, while their names appear only in arrest records or parish fines. And still the city defends this place. Officials argue that shutting it down would corrupt respectable wives and maidens. Some even boast that brothel taxes fund bridges and walls. As you kneel in church, you glance upward and wonder whether the very roof sheltering your prayers was paid for by desperate men chasing pleasure. That is the economy of the Middle Ages. One hand wagging a finger at sin, while the other pockets the profits. And now, with the weight of that hypocrisy hanging in your mind, you push through the door and step inside. You're standing now in that lobby, the air thick with smoke, the floor sticky with spilled ale. Somewhere above, laughter mixes with muffled groans. At a table, a drunk noble shouts for another jug, while in the corner, the madam watches everything with hawk eyes. She knows who has paid, who still owes, who needs to be thrown out before trouble starts. She is part landlady, part banker, part warden. And make no mistake, this is her kingdom. The men might swagger in with coins and boasts, but inside these walls, it's her rules. Without her, the whole system collapses into chaos. She doesn't care if it's sin. She cares if the rent is paid. So here you are, medieval traveler. You've stepped across the threshold of the Middle Ages' most tolerated sin. The brothel is not a fantasy of silk sheets and whispered romance. It is a business, brutal and blunt, built on the backs of women, society damned but could not do without. You are not in a castle. You are not in a fairy tale. You are in a brothel, where morality is optional, desire is currency, and the only certainty is that everyone pretends not to notice in the daylight. Would you like me to keep drafting the rest of the chapters in sequence like this, one at a time, or jump around to the juiciest ones first? You can smell it before you see it. That's the truth of medieval brothels. Forget discreet neon signs or velvet curtains. In the Middle Ages, your nose did the navigating long before your eyes. a sickly perfume of stale ale, wood smoke, sweat, and something ranker drifted down the alleyways, slipping through cracks in the timbered walls. Add a hint of cheap incense, half burned to mask the human stench, and you knew you were getting close. Cities didn't build brothels in their shining squares or beneath cathedral spires. They tucked them into corners, shoved them down lanes, pressed them up against the liminal edges of urban life. Out of sight, officially, but never out of reach. Rivers were a favorite place. Follow the stinking watercourse where butchers dumped offal and tanners poured vats of chemicals, and soon enough you'd stumble into the red light district. The logic was simple. The poor lived by the rivers, the outcasts worked by the rivers, and what was one more undesirable institution squatting by the banks? The sound of sloshing water mixed with the calls of women leaning from windows, and the city could pretend that if sin drifted out, at least it floated downstream. In Paris, the Seine carried away more than laundry. In London, Southwark's brothels stood across the Thames like a moral quarantine zone, visible but separated by a stretch of filthy current. City gates were another prime location. Travelers entered hungry, thirsty, and lonely, and brothels were waiting to oblige. Merchants stopping for the night, soldiers on leave, pilgrims who'd prayed too long and drank too much, all of them passed through the gates, and all of them brought coin. A brothel near the gate was convenience incarnate, the medieval equivalent of a gas station with snacks on the highway. You didn't need to find it. It found you the moment you crossed into town. And when you left again, you carried its smell on your clothes and its stain on your soul, whether or not anyone dared say it aloud. But perhaps the most infamous placements were in the twisting alleys, those medieval veins where light barely touched the cobblestones. Narrow, crooked, and shadowed by upper stories leaning so close they nearly kissed, these lanes were designed for things people pretended not to see. Brothels fit here like a secret slotted into its box. You might wander past the local baker, hear the clang of the blacksmith's forge, then slip suddenly into a darker passage where painted signs or crude carvings on the walls hinted at pleasures for sale. The brothel didn't announce itself like a church bell. It murmured, beckoned, and waited. If you were looking, you'd find it. If you weren't, you'd still hear the laughter at night and wonder what kind of games were being played in the dark. This wasn't random chaos. Towns carefully mapped these spaces, drawing invisible lines between what was respectable and what was tolerated. Authorities knew brothels would exist, whether they wanted them or not. Better, they reasoned, to herd them into controlled zones. In some cities they were placed outside the main walls, a liminal belt of sin circling the righteous core. In others, they were clustered into stews or closed houses, their very names, a reminder that this was filth contained. The stews of Southwark, officially licensed by the Bishop of Winchester, lined the streets with taverns, bathhouses, and brothels, each one stamped with tacit approval from the very churchmen who thundered against lust on Sundays. Regulation masqueraded as morality. The council taxed the women, dictated what they could wear, sometimes even fixed their prices. The message was clear. Vice was acceptable, so long as the city profited from it. And yet regulation never erased stigma. Even when towns gave brothels districts of their own, respectable citizens kept their noses turned up, as if the stench could be held at bay by sheer disapproval. Brothels were fenced off, hemmed in by laws and boundaries, but they were never invisible. If anything, the segregation made them more notorious. Everyone knew exactly where the alleys of indulgence were. Everyone knew which riverbank to avoid in daylight and which gate to skirt when traveling with wives or daughters. Denial was a civic performance, but the truth was an open secret carved into the geography itself. It wasn't only about containment. Proximity mattered. Brothels were close enough to draw traffic, far enough that sin could be blamed on the district rather than the city as a whole. Authorities didn't want lust spilling into parish households. but neither did they want to drive it so far out that men skipped town altogether. The placement was deliberate, balancing temptation and distance like a careful dance. You could wander to sin in 5 minutes flat, but it still felt like stepping into a different world, a place where normal rules bent and cracked. And then there was the sound. Even if you swore you'd never enter, even if you turned your nose away from the smell, you couldn't block out the noises. Music and shouts and drunken songs bled through the alleys at night. Laughter rang false and sharp, mixed with groans and slurred arguments. For neighbors unlucky enough to live close by, the soundtrack of sin was unavoidable. Parents tried to cover children's ears, priests railed from pulpits, but the sound of the brothel carried. It was the background hum of medieval urban life, as much a part of the town's heartbeat as the clang of the smith or the chant of the choir. Imagine arriving as a traveler, stepping off the road after days of mud and hunger. The city gate yawns open, vendors press bread into your hands, and the air is alive with smells. A breeze carries a different scent, thick, smoky, with undertones of sweat and ale. You follow it instinctively down the side lane, half curious, half ashamed. The cobblestones grow slick, the shadows deepen, and then you see the crooked doorway lit by a guttering torch. A woman leans against the wall, her striped cloak marking her trade as clearly as any guild badge. Behind her, the doorway swallows laughter and heat. You've arrived at the place the city pretends it doesn't need, though it's been carefully placed exactly where you would find it. That is the geography of medieval lust. It was never an accident. Brothels clung to riversides, huddled by gates, or burrowed into alleys because that's where society shoved them, wanting them close but never too close, useful but never respectable. You can walk away now if you want, back to the bright square where merchants hawk spices and children chase chickens. But even there, even in the heart of the town, you'll still smell the faint trace on the breeze, hear the echo in the distance, and know the brothel is never truly out of sight. Congrats, you've found the door. Not the kind of door that guards castles or invites you into a cathedral, but the crooked, sagging wooden entrance that leads to temptation dressed as survival. The front door of a medieval brothel doesn't shine, doesn't gleam, doesn't promise luxury. It leans tiredly on rusting iron hinges that groan like old men every time someone pushes their way in. The wood is rough, swollen with rain, and scarred with knife marks, initials, and the occasional crude drawing scratched in by drunks with too much time and not enough imagination. Paint, if there ever was any, has long since peeled away in strips, leaving behind a surface mottled with age and grime. Sometimes, someone slaps on a coat of red to make the point clear, but it never lasts. The weather scrapes it away, and the door resumes its original shade, the color of dirt and resignation. Step closer, and the ground tells its own story. Cobblestones slick with ale and piss form suspicious puddles that glisten in the torchlight, inviting you to test your luck with every step. Something drips steadily from the gutter above. Not quite rainwater, not quite sewage, but a reminder that in this part of town, nothing is clean. Rats dart across your path as if they own the place, which they do, really. And the smell hits before your knuckles ever reach the door. It's a cocktail of sweat, smoke, cheap perfume, spilled beer, and the sour tang of human desperation. Compared to this, even the fish market feels like a meadow of wildflowers. The noise confirms what your nose has already told you. From behind the crooked door comes a muffled symphony of chaos. Laughter sharp and jagged, like glass breaking in the dark. Music played badly on a lute, missing a string, clashing with the pounding of boots on the floor. Voices rise and fall, some sweet, some slurred, some angry. Then there are the sounds you don't mistake for anything else. The grunts, the squeals, the moans. It's a house alive with noise, the sort of soundscape you can't mistake for prayer or work or family. This is commerce. Flesh turned into currency, and the walls do nothing to hide it. Forget the flashing neon lights of modern red light districts, buzzing signs promising girls, 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 or the glow of fluorescent bulbs above clubs that never close. Medieval brothels had no electricity, no bright signals in the night sky. Their invitation came from candlelight, smoky and unreliable. A stub of tallow candle perched in a rusted iron sconce by the door dripped hot wax down the wall, leaving black trails of soot like scars. The flame wavered in the wind, guttered, then flared back, casting shadows that made the doorway look less like an entrance and more like a mouth, yawning open to swallow you whole. No buzz, no glamour. Just fire slowly choking the ceiling with smoke, a primitive lighthouse guiding sailors of lust to their harbor. As you reach for the latch, it resists, not because it wants to keep you out, but because it barely works. The iron is bent, the wood swollen, and the entire mechanism feels like it might snap off in your hand. Push harder, and the hinges screech, loud enough to announce your arrival to anyone listening. The door doesn't just open. It complains. It makes sure every head inside swivels your way. Every eye sizes you up, deciding whether you're coin to be squeezed, trouble to be avoided, or a fool too green to know what you've stumbled into. The door is no gate of heaven. It's a threshold that humbles you before you've even crossed it. And then, suddenly, you're inside, and the first impression hits like a bucket of cold ditch water. The floor is sticky beneath your boots, a patchwork of straw meant to soak up spills that gave up years ago. The air is thick, a mixture of smoke from the hearth, sweat from bodies pressed too close, and a haze of incense, attempting but failing to sanctify the profane. Shadows dance across the crooked beams overhead, not from artistry but because candlelight doesn't care about flattery. You're not in a place designed to soothe your senses. You're in a place meant to overwhelm them. The entryway itself is no grand foyer. A few benches line the wall, scarred and greasy from decades of restless backsides. A bucket sits in the corner, its purpose uncertain, but none of the possibilities are pleasant. Someone has hung a faded curtain in an attempt to create mystery, but it's more rag than fabric, stained and torn, fluttering whenever the door opens, as if trying to escape. The floor slopes toward a drain that doesn't quite drain, where liquids of uncertain origin collect into a permanent swamp. First impressions matter, and here the impression is clear. Leave your dignity at the door, because it has no business following you inside. In modern terms, you might expect music to set the mood, lighting to flatter, decor to seduce. Instead, you get the medieval version, a lute twanging out of tune, candles dripping wax like stalactites of filth, and walls sweating with condensation. The whole place feels alive, but not in a way that comforts. It's the life of mold creeping in the corners, fleas skittering through straw, drunkards slurring songs they don't remember the words to. If neon lights are the modern world's promise of polished vice, medieval candles were its raw reality. Smoke, soot, and shadows, all of it whispering that what waits beyond the curtain is neither glamorous nor kind. And yet, despite the filth, despite the noise, despite the fact that every sensible bone in your body should be screaming to turn back, people keep coming. The front door of sin isn't meant to repel. It's meant to test. If you push through the smell, the sound, the suspicion, then you've already made your choice. You've crossed a threshold not just of wood and iron, but of morality and reputation. Outside, you can pretend you're respectable. Inside, the world knows what you've come for. So you close the door behind you, letting the latch clatter back into place, and the sound is final. The city disappears outside, swallowed by night. In here, the rules shift. Candlelight flickers, shadows stretch, and the crooked wooden door you just passed through becomes more than an entrance. It becomes a barrier. Once you're in, and the street outside no longer matters. The front door of a medieval brothel doesn't just separate two spaces. It separates two selves, the one who pretends and the one who admits. And as the hinges creak shut, the only question left is which one you really are. Step inside, and the first thing you realize is that calling this space a lobby is generous, almost flattering, like calling a dung heap a flower bed. The so-called reception area of a medieval brothel isn't designed to welcome you with warmth or comfort. It's designed to separate you from your hesitation, your dignity, and eventually your money. You push past the crooked curtain that serves as a half-hearted attempt at privacy, and the smell punches you full in the face before anything else registers. It's a heady cocktail of spilled ale, unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and the faint ghost of perfume. Cheap rose water, lavender oil, or sometimes just animal fat rubbed with herbs to trick the nose into something resembling sweetness. The perfume doesn't mask the stench. It mixes with it, creating an atmosphere that clings to your clothes and your skin as if determined to follow you home. The benches along the walls sag under the weight of bodies, not just men but sometimes women, peasants and apprentices and soldiers still smelling of horses, all crowded shoulder to shoulder in anticipation. Some sit slumped with exhaustion, tankards dangling from calloused hands, while others lean forward, restless, eyes darting toward the stairwell or the side rooms where muffled laughter and groans promise release. There's no orderly queue, no polite waiting. It's more like a livestock auction with perfume, a place where men jostle and shout and size each other up while pretending they aren't. The tension is palpable, a strange mixture of lust and poverty, as if everyone here knows they're buying a few moments of escape they can barely afford. Ale flows freely but not generously. Tankards are refilled from barrels of thin, sour beer that tastes more like damp straw than hops, but no one complains. The drink isn't about flavor. It's about courage, dulling the edge of shame before the deed is done. A few men already sway where they sit, voices rising in bawdy songs or arguments that could ignite into fists at any second. The noise is constant, a wall of sound where laughter, curses, and drunken chanting mingle with the creak of wood and the hiss of fire. Somewhere in the back, a lute player plucks at strings that haven't been tuned in months, the melody stumbling under the weight of drunken interruptions. The floor beneath your boots sticks slightly, a layer of spilled drink, sweat, and whatever else has been trampled into the rushes. Straw is scattered to soak up the worst of it, but it's damp and already smells like rot. In the flickering candlelight, shadows stretch across the uneven beams, exaggerating the room into a cavern where everyone's flaws are magnified. The air is thick with smoke from a fireplace that struggles to draw properly, filling the rafters with a haze that makes your eyes water. And through that haze, faces emerge. Women painted in powders and rouge, hovering like hawks, laughing too loud, brushing against shoulders with a practiced air of intimacy. Their greetings aren't subtle. A hand slips across a man's back. A whispered promise drips into an ear. A playful tug on a sleeve pulls someone deeper inside. These women are saleswomen first, comforters second. They flirt, tease, cajole, and laugh at jokes that don't deserve it, all while scanning for hesitation in a man's eyes. Hesitation means he needs convincing, and convincing means more coin. For every smile, there is calculation. For every touch, a price. And the men, half drunk and already teetering between guilt and need, lean into it, because here performance is enough. No one came looking for love. They came to rent a feeling, and even the illusion will do. But for all the laughter and the feigned affection, the poverty bleeds through. Clothes are patched and worn thin, the hearth's heat barely reaches the corners, and the ale tastes like it was brewed to punish the throat rather than soothe it. This isn't a place of glamour. It's a place where desperation is dressed up with powder and candlelight, where the stink of sweat is hidden beneath the thin veil of incense, and where the very walls seem to lean in, hungry for the coins that will be slipped across the table. The women laugh, but their eyes are sharp, watching for men who will haggle too hard, drink too much, or worse, refuse to pay at all. If you look closely, the room tells two stories at once. On the surface, it's rowdy, loud, alive with energy. Beneath that noise, it's weary, sagging under the weight of what it truly is. The laughter is too loud, the flirting too practiced, the perfume too strong. It's theater, and everyone here is both audience and actor, pretending not to notice the truth. The men pretend they are wanted, the women pretend they are willing, and the brothel itself, this crooked room filled with smoke and shouting, pretends it is something more than what it really is, a waiting room for sin. When you enter, no one offers to take your coat. No one welcomes you warmly or guides you politely to your seat. You shove your way through, stepping over puddles, brushing against sweaty shoulders, catching stray laughter on your sleeve. Your presence is noted but not celebrated. You're just another face, another coin, another body feeding the endless churn. Respect doesn't exist here. The brothel has no interest in dignity. It's not a reception hall. It's an open mouth, and you've just walked across its tongue. And yet, for all the filth and noise and dishonesty, men return again and again, because behind the smoke and shouting lies the promise of something they can't find outside. Not affection, not love, not even comfort, just distraction. A brief escape from the grind of labor, the cold of winter, the pressure of church bells tolling guilt into every hour. That's what this so-called lobby offers. Not welcome, but the pause before surrender. The moment when you realize the choice has already been made. You stand there, squinting through smoke, breathing in air that tastes of ash and perfume, and the room seems to breathe with you, hot and heavy and close. It isn't beautiful. It isn't even particularly inviting, but it works. It draws you in, presses you down onto a sticky bench, hands you a tankard, and waits. Because in the end, the lobby of a medieval brothel doesn't need to charm you. It only needs to hold you long enough until you stop thinking and start spending. The moment you cross the threshold, the first thing that assaults you isn't the sight of painted faces or the sound of drunken laughter. It's the smell. It arrives before the room even comes into focus, creeping up your nostrils, clinging to your throat, and lodging itself somewhere behind your eyes. It's not one smell, but a whole army of them marching together, a layered symphony of sweat, ale, unwashed bodies, urine, and smoke. The air itself feels heavy, humid with breath and dampness, and each inhale is less about breathing and more about survival. You can almost chew it. The scent has weight. The dominant note is sweat, rank and sour, the kind that comes from days of labor followed by nights of excess. Men haven't bathed in weeks, their wool tunics stiff with grime, their hair slick with oil and dust. That sweat soaks into the benches, the walls, the straw scattered on the floor, and by the time you enter the brothel, it's already seeped into the wood like a permanent stain. On top of that comes the ale, endlessly poured and endlessly spilled, sour beer soaking into the rushes, pooling into sticky puddles, and fermenting in the corners where no one bothers to clean. Every footstep releases a damp reminder of last night's binge, and the smell drifts upward in little ghosts of rot. But the odor doesn't stop there. Somewhere close by, probably behind the building or in a bucket tucked away behind a curtain, is the stench of urine. Sometimes it mixes with the faint tang of human waste dumped too near the doorway, because when you've had enough ale and enough time in a room with no real plumbing, you do what you must. That ammonia sting cuts through the fog of sweat and beer, sharp enough to make your eyes water if you linger near the wrong spot. It never fully leaves. Even when incense is burning or herbs are scattered on the floor, the acrid bite lurks underneath, waiting to remind you exactly where you are. The brothel keepers know this. They try to fight back, and their weapons are pitiful but persistent. Bundles of dried rosemary and lavender hang from the beams, their scent faint but noticeable if you stand directly beneath them. Bowls of sage or juniper might smolder in the hearth, sending out thin streams of smoke that mingle with the wood-fire haze. Sometimes rose water is sprinkled near the benches, or a woman dabs a little oil on her neck before approaching a client. It doesn't cover the stench, it simply layers another fragrance onto it, creating a nauseating cocktail of flowers and filth. What should be sweet smells cloying, too thick, and when it mixes with sweat and sour beer, it feels less like perfume and more like mockery. Candles burn everywhere, dripping tallow onto wooden stands, but even the wax smells animal, fatty and smoky, filling the room with another greasy note. Every flame adds soot to the rafters, and the combination of smoke and body odor creates a haze you can practically taste. The mildew rising from damp straw and warped wood gives it a final flourish, a moldy tang that coats your tongue if you breathe through your mouth. And yet everyone in the room carries on as if nothing is wrong. Because after a few minutes, your nose gives up. It stops fighting and simply surrenders, folding the whole mess into one smell that becomes the background of the night. But you never quite escape it. It clings to your hair, to your clothes, to your skin. When you finally step outside into the cooler air, you'll still feel it in your nostrils, as if the brothel itself followed you home. And that is perhaps its cruelest trick. The odor isn't just part of the brothel. It's part of you now. You can wash your hands, change your tunic, douse yourself in herbs, but for hours afterward, you'll swear you can still smell it. A ghost of sweat and smoke and cheap incense that refuses to die. For the women working here, the smell is more than a nuisance. It's a uniform. Their bodies carry it everywhere, the stink of labor and lust marking them long after the last man leaves. No matter how much rose oil they dab or how often they burn sage, the truth seeps into their skin. When they walk through the market the next morning, heads turn not only because of the way they dress or laugh, but because people can smell where they've been. Shame doesn't need to be shouted when it floats invisibly in the air around you. And yet, somehow, in this overpowering cloud of filth, men still convince themselves the room is seductive. They convince themselves that the haze of smoke and perfume is romantic, that the scent of ale on the air is welcoming, that the heat of bodies pressed together is intoxicating. They drink until the edge of disgust dulls, until their noses stop warning them, until the smell becomes part of the experience rather than an obstacle. And once they cross that line, the odor is no longer repellent. It's proof they're in the right place. You can almost imagine the brothel sighing when the door opens, breathing its heavy musk into your lungs like a welcome. And whether you gag or grin depends less on the air itself than on what you came here looking for. Because if you came for purity, you'll choke on the first breath. But if you came for sin, the smell tells you you've found it. The brothel doesn't look at you with neon lights or polished signs. It doesn't need to. It announces itself in every inhalation, every swallow of mildew-soaked air, every mouthful of smoke and sweat. The smell is the true threshold. Once you accept it, you've already stepped deeper in than you realize. If you thought the brothel ran itself, you'd be wrong. Behind every creaking door, every drunken laugh, every clink of coins into a tankard, there is one figure making sure the chaos never spills too far. The madam. She's the power broker of the house. The one woman who isn't here to sell her body but to sell everyone else's. If the prostitutes are the workers, she's the boss, the middle manager, the HR department, the accountant, the bouncer, and the damage control officer all rolled into one lace-trimmed package. And she knows it. The madam is not some sweet motherly figure looking out for her girls. She's a businesswoman in a world that pretends women shouldn't have power, which means she's had to fight tooth and nail for every inch of it. She may have once been one of the women on the benches, but those days are behind her now. She's clawed her way up through grit, cunning, and probably a handful of ruined reputations. She doesn't survive by kindness but by control. Her eyes are sharp, her tongue sharper, and her ledger the sharpest of all. Because in this place, what matters most is not pleasure or affection. It's profit. She handles the money with the precision of a miserly priest. Every coin paid to a woman in this house ultimately passes through her hands. She takes her cut first, always, and it is not small. Some of it goes to the landlord, some to the city officials who expect their regular bribe, and the rest to her own purse. What's left trickles down to the workers, barely enough to keep them clothed, fed, and alive. And yet, in a twisted way, the women need her. Without her, there's no roof, no organization, no buffer between them and the authorities who would shut them down one day and demand taxes the next. The madam is both parasite and protector. She is also the disciplinarian. If a girl steps out of line, skims coins, fights with a customer, drinks too much ale before her work, the madam comes down on her with all the fury of a guild master whose apprentice ruined a commission. She'll shout, slap, dock wages, or worse, throw the offender out into the street where survival becomes even less likely. In her house, order is paramount. Drunkenness is tolerated from the clients, never from the workers. Tears are allowed, but only behind closed doors. The madam doesn't run a charity. She runs a business, and her reputation depends on keeping the brothel functioning like a rickety but relentless machine. The city knows her name too, though they'll never say it with respect. To officials, she's a necessary evil, a woman whose existence spares decent wives and daughters from unwanted advances. The brothel, after all, is tolerated because it keeps lust quarantined, and so the madam becomes the city's unofficial partner in sin. They tax her, they fine her, they summon her to hearings, and sometimes they parade her in front of priests for ritual scolding, but they never shut her down for long. Everyone understands the truth. A brothel without a madam is chaos, but a brothel with one is order, and order is valuable. Her power is visible in her appearance. She dresses better than the women under her command, often in brighter fabrics, thicker cloaks, and jewelry that suggests taste rather than desperation. A silver clasp on her belt, a fur-lined hood in winter, a gown that may not be fine but is certainly clean. These are her armor. She wants customers to see her and know instantly who is in charge. She may even carry a key ring at her side, the sound of metal jangling as she walks across the uneven floorboards, each key a reminder that she holds the locks, the doors, and the authority to open or close them at will. And don't think for a second she's only handling the books. The madam is also the enforcer. If a client gets violent, refuses to pay, or threatens one of her women, she's the first to storm into the room. Sometimes she comes with a stick, sometimes with a hired muscle standing behind her, but her presence alone is often enough. Men know the rules of this house, and crossing the madam means finding yourself tossed into the street with a bloody nose and no refund. The city might turn a blind eye to the women's suffering, but the madam doesn't. Not out of compassion, but because violence is bad for business. Dead or broken women can't make money, and a brothel with a reputation for murder will soon be a brothel with no customers. She is feared, but she is also respected, and in some ways envied. In a time when most women can barely control their own marriages, she commands a household of men and women, manages finances, and negotiates with officials. She cannot hold office, she cannot join a guild, and she certainly cannot preach from a pulpit. But she rules here more firmly than many lords rule their villages. In the fragile hierarchy of medieval society, she has carved out a strange, precarious throne, balancing sin and survival on the edge of respectability. Yet, for all her power, the madam is not untouchable. Whispers follow her in the market. Priests thunder against her from the pulpit. Neighbors spit when she walks past. She might wear clean gowns and silver clasps, but in the eyes of polite society, she's still filth, still a trafficker of souls, still the embodiment of everything wrong with the world, and she knows it. Every coin she collects carries the stink of both survival and damnation. Every smile she forces is calculated to mask the truth that her empire is fragile, built on the backs of desperate women and the lust of reckless men. But that's the paradox of the madam. She is both powerless and powerful, damned and necessary, shamed and essential. She thrives in the cracks of medieval morality, where sin is condemned but also quietly organized, taxed, and tolerated. She doesn't need your approval. She doesn't even want it. All she wants is the coin, the order, and the knowledge that when the night is over, the doors of her house will open again tomorrow. So when you step into the brothel and see her across the smoky lobby, her sharp eyes following every movement, her hand tightening on the ledger, her voice cutting through the din, understand this. You've just met the most dangerous woman in the room. If you imagine the women of a medieval brothel as glamorous seductresses draped in silk and jewels, you're about to be disappointed. The truth is far less romantic. The women who worked here were not femme fatales whispering poetry into the ears of dukes. They were mostly the poor, the desperate, the abandoned, and the discarded. For many, the brothel wasn't a choice so much as the only door that didn't slam shut in their faces. Poverty was the great recruiter. In a world where most people lived on the edge of hunger, women without land, without family, or without a husband were walking disasters waiting to happen. A widow with no inheritance, a daughter too poor for a dowry, or a servant girl tossed into the street for one mistake might all end up here, knocking on the brothel's door not because they wanted to, but because they had nowhere else to go. For some, it was that or starve. For others, it was that or wander the streets until their bodies gave out. And for a few, it was thrust upon them by relatives who saw the profit in selling a girl's future for a handful of coins. Orphans were particularly vulnerable. Medieval cities were filled with children who had lost their parents to famine, plague, or war. Without protection, they became easy prey for brothel owners or recruiters who promised them food and shelter in exchange for work. A teenage girl with no family was worth more in flesh than in labor, and many were funneled into prostitution before they were old enough to understand what it meant. Some were outright sold by guardians who couldn't afford to keep them. Others lured in by promises of wages, and some simply forced through debt slavery, a system where a family's unpaid dues could be worked off by their daughter's body. But not every woman inside these walls came from chains or coercion. There were some who chose it, if choice is the right word. A farmer's daughter tired of endless toil, a servant fleeing abuse in her master's house, or a woman unwilling to accept a loveless arranged marriage might see the brothel as a twisted kind of independence. Here, at least, she might keep some of her earnings. Here, she might avoid the backbreaking labor of the fields. Here, she might carve out a small shred of control, even if it came at the highest cost. Compared to starvation or bondage, the brothel could look, in its own grotesque way, like freedom. Still, the illusion of agency had sharp edges. Even when a woman entered willingly, she was rarely free once inside. The madam controlled her wages, her movements, her hours, and sometimes even her very body, marking debts against her for food, clothes, or lodging until she could never crawl out. A few might strike lucky, finding a wealthy patron who bought their contract and kept them as mistresses. But for most, the brothel was less a career and more a slow, grinding trap. Women aged fast in this line of work, and once their youth faded, they were often cast out into the same streets they had come from, only now with the added stain of reputation. And reputation mattered. If a medieval city tolerated brothels, it did not respect them. Prostitutes carried the weight of social stigma heavier than the lice in their clothes. They were seen as polluted, sinful, unworthy of marriage, and dangerous to the moral fabric of society. Priests thundered about their damnation. Respectable women crossed the street to avoid them, and even the men who visited nightly were quick to condemn them publicly. They were needed, but never honored. They were tools, not neighbors. Their existence was considered a shameful necessity, and society made sure they felt it every single day. This stigma followed them everywhere. They could be forbidden from wearing certain clothes, banned from church services, barred from festivals, and even denied burial in consecrated ground. Laws labeled them as common women, a phrase that stripped away individuality and reduced them to a category of sin. In some cities, they were forced to live in marked districts, wear identifying badges, or follow curfews, as if their mere presence were a contagion. Even when they tried to leave the trade, the stain lingered, making it nearly impossible to marry, to find respectable work, or to step back into society. Inside the brothel, though, among others like themselves, the women created their own kind of community. They laughed together, drank together, nursed each other through sickness, and shared tricks for dealing with the worst clients. In a world that hated them, they made a family out of fellow exiles. But this solidarity didn't erase the reality. Their bodies were commodities, their futures precarious, their names whispered with disdain. They lived in a fragile limbo, tolerated by the city, despised by the church, and forever trapped in a cycle of survival through shame. So when you picture who worked in a medieval brothel, forget the fantasy of silken courtesans whispering in candlelight. Think instead of the widow cast out with nothing but grief, the orphan too young to understand why she's here, the servant fleeing a master's blows, or the daughter sold for her father's debts. Think of women clinging to survival in a world that offered them no other road, paying for each scrap of security with pieces of themselves they could never get back. This was not empowerment, it was endurance, and every woman who stepped through those crooked doors did so carrying both hunger and humiliation in her shadow. Step into a medieval brothel, and you'll notice something immediately. The clothes. Not because they're fine, not because they're flattering, but because they scream louder than the women themselves. If you thought prostitutes dressed however they pleased, think again. Cities had rules about what they could and couldn't wear, and the effect was a kind of walking billboard announcing exactly what kind of business they were in. Respectable women hid behind veils, head coverings, and modest gowns. Prostitutes were often ordered by law to do the opposite. Bright colors, plunging necklines, sometimes striped cloaks or bells stitched onto hems so no one could mistake them for a virtuous wife at 20 paces. Imagine being legally required to jingle while you walked, like a human warning sign. That was the reality for many sex workers in Europe's towns. The intention was humiliation. Authorities wanted prostitutes visible and marked, not just for customers, but for everyone else who might forget their place. A wife could walk to church in a modest wool dress, her hair tucked carefully under a white linen coif. A prostitute, on the other hand, might be forced to wear scarlet shoes or striped mantles, so even from across the street her identity was obvious. Some cities banned them from wearing veils entirely, stripping away a woman's ability to disappear into the crowd. Others forced them into a kind of uniform, coarse, brightly dyed fabrics that marked them as sinners by law. And while courtesans in Venice or Avignon might get away with silks and jewelry, the average brothel worker wasn't stepping out of her chamber in anything that could be mistaken for luxury. Still, the clothing they did wear had its own kind of theater. Bodices cut lower than church law approved, skirts showing more ankle than polite society could bear, sleeves loose enough to slide down at just the right moment. These weren't garments designed for comfort. They were designed for business. A neckline wasn't simply fashion. It was advertisement. The brighter the dye, the lower the cut, the clearer the signal. You weren't here to spin wool or churn butter. You were here to sell something else. Of course, laws and reality didn't always match. Many women tried to dress as close to respectability as they could, especially when they left the brothel, because walking through town in a clownish striped cloak wasn't exactly safe. People jeered, priests spat sermons at them, and children threw stones. So they improvised. Some stitched extra fabric onto bodices to make them look less revealing when they went out. Others wore second-hand gowns cast off by wealthier women, altering them into something serviceable. But even so, the difference between them and respectable wives was painfully obvious. Respectable women covered their hair with wimples or hoods. Prostitutes might leave their heads uncovered, their hair braided or perfumed, a silent announcement that they were available. The contrast wasn't just fabric, it was identity, sewn into every seam. And while it may sound like they strutted confidently in bright skirts and jingling bells, the truth is less glamorous. Clothes were expensive, and a brothel girl's wardrobe was usually small and filthy. A single wool gown worn night after night, patched at the elbows, reeking of smoke, sweat, and cheap perfume that failed miserably at its job. Corsets, when worn, weren't delicate whalebone fantasies. They were stiff, scratchy, and smelled like goat hide left too long in the rain. That corset doesn't hold you in with elegance. It squeezes you like a vice and smells like goat and tragedy. Add in stockings that never quite matched, shoes with holes worn through the leather, and you have the reality of medieval, seductive fashion. The smell alone could undo any illusion. Perfume was expensive, so most women used crushed herbs, smoke from incense, or even rose water to cover the odors of unwashed fabric. But none of it lasted. After a few hours in a crowded brothel, the combination of stale beer, sweat, and mildew overpowered every sprig of lavender pinned to a bodice. Patrons might walk in enticed by the flash of cleavage or a bright skirt, but once they sat down, their noses told them the truth. That dress had seen things. Yet, in spite of the stench, the scratches, the humiliation of striped cloaks, there was a strange kind of resilience in how these women dressed. They leaned into what little power their clothes gave them. A neckline tugged a bit lower when business was slow. A borrowed shawl draped artfully to suggest mystery. A ribbon tied in the hair to brighten a tired face. These were small acts of control in a life that offered almost none. Clothing wasn't just uniform. It was armor, disguise, and currency all in one. It's tempting to laugh at the absurdity of laws that made women wear bells like livestock or cloaks like moving caution signs. But beneath the humor lies cruelty. Every jingle, every flash of striped fabric was a reminder that they were outsiders, tolerated only for the needs of men, branded for a trade they could rarely escape. And yet, when you walked through that brothel door, the sight of those low-cut bodices and bright skirts was as much part of the experience as the smell of smoke or the roar of drunken laughter. It was theater, yes, but theater paid for in dignity. So the next time you imagine medieval prostitutes as alluring courtesans wrapped in velvet, remember the truth. Their outfits were less about seduction and more about survival. Bright fabric to catch an eye, a plunging bodice to advertise, a striped cloak to humiliate. Clothes that didn't make them feel powerful, but made them visible, vulnerable, and permanently marked. They didn't wear fashion, they wore stigma. And somehow, beneath all the sweat and goat-scented tragedy, they still managed to turn it into a business. Step inside a medieval brothel, and it doesn't take long to notice that presentation is everything. The women here are expected to look enticing, even if they've been working 16-hour days in a building that smells like smoke, urine, and desperation. So how do you create the illusion of beauty in a world without Sephora, hot showers, or fluoride? With a lot of creativity, a dash of poison, and a willingness to smear things on your face that today would come with a warning label. This is medieval makeup and grooming, half ritual, half hazard, and fully committed to the fantasy of allure. Let's start with the skin. Pale was in. A ghostly complexion meant you weren't toiling in the fields, even if in reality you were earning coins on your back in a smoky room. To get that fashionable pallor, many prostitutes turned to powders made of lead or arsenic. Yes, poison. Congratulations, your foundation is shaving years off your life with every application. The powder was chalky, drying, and clung to the skin in a way that didn't so much hide blemishes as broadcast them with a matte finish of doom. Women smeared it on thick, covering pockmarks, rashes, or the scabs from lice bites, trading long-term health for a short-term glow. Some tried flour, ground chalk, or crushed eggshells as a cheaper alternative, which mostly made them look like badly frosted pastries. But in the dim light of tallow candles, even a dusting of poison could blur the edges of a tired face into something approximating youthful. Rouge was next on the list, because pale skin without color made you look like a corpse. Enter vermilion, a bright red pigment made from, you guessed it, mercury. Slathering that on your cheeks gave you the lively flush of someone who wasn't starving or dying of syphilis. Another option was a cruder, but still popular method, grinding up cochineal insects or red ochre and mixing the powder with animal fat. Congratulations, your lipstick is made from crushed bugs. It worked though. Smear that insect paste on your lips or cheeks, and suddenly you looked less like a half-dead peasant and more like someone ready to sell a fantasy. Of course, the side effect of using mercury-based rouge was tremors, madness, and, eventually, death. But beauty has always been about suffering, right? The eyes were trickier. There wasn't mascara as we know it, but women improvised with soot and charcoal to darken eyelashes or line their lids. Smudge a little ash around the eyes, and you went from exhausted washerwoman to mysterious temptress. Or at least that was the idea. Sometimes herbs were mixed in, like belladonna, which could dilate the pupils and give a wide-eyed, sultry look. The problem? Belladonna is toxic, so while your eyes might look dreamy, your vision could also blur permanently. Imagine trying to lock eyes with a client while silently wondering if you're about to go blind. Seduction meets hazard, medieval style. Hair presented its own set of challenges. Forget modern shampoo. Soap was harsh, rare, and often avoided because of superstitions that water spread disease. Grease and lice were constant companions, and combing out nits was a communal event, sometimes with friends picking through each other's hair like apes. To disguise the state of things, wigs and hairpieces came into play. These were often made from the hair of the dead, or from desperate peasants who sold their locks for a few coins. Styled with ribbons or flowers, they created the illusion of thick, luxurious tresses, while hiding the bald patches caused by lice, ringworm, or syphilitic sores. Wigs also carried their own ecosystem of pests, so if you thought slipping one on meant instant glamour, think again. It was more like donning a portable terrarium of vermin and hoping no one noticed when it itched. And then there were false beauty marks. In a world where pox scars and smallpox pits were common, the idea of disguising them with a strategically placed patch of cloth became popular. A tiny bit of black velvet glued to the face could be styled as a mouche, a fly mark that was somehow chic. It was a distraction technique. Don't look at the rotting teeth or infected rash. Look at this tiny dot that says, flirt, in medieval face code. Prostitutes used them liberally, not just to cover blemishes, but to signal personality. Placed near the mouth, it suggested playfulness. Near the eye, mystery. On the forehead, arrogance. Of course, the glue often failed in the sweaty, smoky air, so patches sometimes slid off mid-conversation, leaving the wearer scrambling to stick them back on before the illusion crumbled. Scent mattered too. With regular bathing seen as dangerous and water often avoided altogether, perfume and herbs became survival tools. Prostitutes burned incense in their chambers to mask the overwhelming smell of bodies. They rubbed rosemary or lavender into their hair, not just for fragrance but in the vague hope of repelling lice. Musk, ambergris, or civet were available to the wealthier courtesans, but for most women, the perfume was a handful of crushed mint leaves or rosewater dabbed onto a gown. The result was less romantic allure and more faintly floral barnyard. But compared to the stench of sweat, mildew, and ale, even a sprig of thyme pinned to a bodice was a small mercy. Grooming extended to teeth as well, though oral care was a generous term. White teeth were desirable, but with no toothbrushes or toothpaste, most prostitutes used cloth rags dipped in salt or ash to scrub away grime. The result was gums that bled constantly and teeth that cracked from abrasion. Some chewed herbs like sage or parsley to freshen breath, but there was no hiding the inevitable rot. The candlelight helped. What looked like a charming smile in the gloom was, up close, a battlefield of cavities and infection. Still, a dab of rouge, a low neckline, and enough ale in the client's bloodstream could make even the worst smile pass for alluring. The reality versus the fantasy was stark. Patrons wanted the illusion of beauty. Pale skin, rosy cheeks, dark eyes, luscious hair, and sweet perfume. What they got was powder made of poison, blush from bugs, wigs crawling with lice, and perfume that barely disguised the smell of sweat and sickness. But illusion doesn't have to be perfect. It only has to be convincing for long enough to do its job. And in the dim, smoky light of a medieval brothel, with ale-numbing senses and desire overriding judgment, it usually worked. So when you picture the painted women of the Middle Ages, don't imagine delicate silk gowns and flawless complexions. Imagine lead dust caked on scabby cheeks, insect paste smudged into cracked lips, wigs scratching raw scalps, and tiny black patches sliding down sweaty faces. Beauty was a mask, literally, and it didn't just cost money. It cost health, dignity, and sometimes life itself. Yet women wore it anyway, because in the cruel economy of a medieval brothel, appearance wasn't optional. It was survival. Painted on with poison and hope, the door creaks open, and in steps the client. And here's where every romantic notion you might have had about medieval gallantry dies a swift, smelly death. Who walks into these brothels? Pretty much everyone. If you thought sex work was only the pastime of a few degenerate rogues, think again. The clientele ranged from barefoot peasants with mud still caked on their ankles to silken-robed merchants with gold rings and suspiciously well-fed bellies. Some were swaggering knights fresh off the battlefield. Others were trembling apprentices who barely had the confidence to make eye contact. And yes, priests came too, their robes tucked discreetly under their cloaks as if God wouldn't notice so long as the hood stayed up. If you lived in a medieval town, chances are someone you knew was sneaking in and out of a brothel, praying their neighbors didn't recognize their boots in the mud outside. Your neighbor the cobbler? He's here too. The peasants were perhaps the least surprising customers. Life was miserable. Marriage was often arranged rather than chosen, and daily existence offered little in the way of pleasure. A trip to the brothel was cheaper than a wife's dowry, and less permanent. They shuffled in with a few coins scraped together, hoping for a quick distraction before trudging back to their huts. Their clothes were rough spun, their hands calloused, and their hygiene questionable at best. They smelled of livestock, manure, and sweat. But inside the brothel, no one judged. The exchange was simple: coins for flesh, anonymity for relief. And when they left, they disappeared back into obscurity, their brief indulgence swallowed by the relentless grind of poverty. Merchants were a different breed altogether. They strutted in with jangling purses, eager not just for sex, but for status. Brothels offered more than bodies. They offered performance, entertainment, and gossip, and merchants relished all of it. They ordered the stronger ale, demanded the prettier girls, and wanted their names whispered with respect. Even here, to them, the brothel was both playground and stage, a place to flaunt wealth and escape the expectations of family life. Wives at home might expect fidelity, daughters demanded dowries, but here, in the smoky haze of candles and sweat, a merchant could pretend he was master of the universe. His silver coins bought more than an hour's company. They bought the illusion that he mattered. And then, There were the knights, swaggering in with chainmail clinking and tempers sharp from ale. Some were loyal retainers, others mercenaries drifting from one battlefield to the next, but all carried the same aura of violence and entitlement. They treated the brothel like conquered ground, swaggering through the door with swords at their hips, tossing down their helmets and barking for drink. Their armor reeked of rust and sweat. Their boots tracked mud and worse across the floor, and yet they carried themselves like kings. To the women, knights were both blessing and curse, big spenders who might pay generously, but also dangerous men who often confused dominance on the battlefield with rights in the bedroom. When knights left, they seldom remembered names, but the women remembered them. Heavy fists, scars across their chests, and laughter that never softened. But the most jarring visitors of all were the men of the cloth, priests, monks, sometimes even higher clerics, cloaked and hooded, whispering prayers under their breath, as though absolution might be retroactive. Officially, the church condemned brothels as dens of sin, corrupting the soul and dragging entire towns into moral decay. Unofficially, the church tolerated them, even regulated them, preferring that lust be contained within certain walls rather than spill out into respectable households. The hypocrisy was staggering. Priests preached chastity from the pulpit in the morning, then shuffled through brothel doors at night, clutching their robes around them like guilty children. Some even rationalized it as shepherding lost sheep, though their sheep happened to be half naked and charging a penny a turn. In some cities, municipal governments actively managed brothels, taxing them and ensuring priests had a convenient outlet that kept scandal away from the altar. It was an arrangement built on silence and contradiction. Denounce sin in public, indulge it in private, and hope the two never collided. Of course, everyone knew. Gossip spread like plague, and it was hardly a secret that Father Thomas lingered too long in the wrong quarter of town. Still, the brothels stayed full, and the sermons kept flowing. God may have been watching, but the priest had other plans on a Tuesday night. The variety of clientele meant that brothels were melting pots unlike anything else in medieval society. Outside those crooked doors, the world was rigidly divided. Lords at the top, peasants at the bottom, clergy hovering somewhere between heaven and hypocrisy. But inside, everyone became the same. A knight might find himself drinking elbow to elbow with a baker. A merchant might swap crude jokes with a shepherd, and a priest might mumble excuses while sitting beside the very butcher who'd confessed to him the week before. The brothel erased distinctions of class, if only for an hour, replacing them with the raw commonality of desire. Here, your title didn't matter, only your coin did. The irony was suffocating. Respectable men railed against prostitutes in public, but paid for their services in private. Husbands accused wives of impropriety, while sneaking off to the alleys themselves. Priests damned women of the night from their pulpits, then blessed themselves before entering their doors. The hypocrisy wasn't hidden, it was woven into the fabric of the age. Brothels thrived precisely because everyone pretended not to see what they saw. And yet, despite the stigma, the brothel was essential. Town leaders knew it, the church knew it, the clients knew it most of all. Without these places, desire spilled into the streets, leading to assaults, scandals, and illegitimate children that threatened family and property alike. Brothels were a pressure valve, ugly but necessary, tolerated like a rat-infested granary. Better to keep it contained than let it overrun the whole village. So who walked into medieval brothels? Everyone. Peasants seeking brief escape, merchants chasing ego, knights chasing conquest, priests chasing hypocrisy, and countless others who wanted, if only for a flickering hour by candlelight, to forget who they were. Behind every crooked door was the unspoken truth of the Middle Ages. Sin was universal, desire was constant, and the line between morality and indulgence was as thin as a coin slipping from hand to hand. Step inside the smoky gloom of a medieval brothel, and you'll find that one of the most uncomfortable rituals doesn't take place in the bedchamber at all. It happens first, in plain view, where desire collides with economy and dignity collapses into bargaining. Forget the romanticized notion of a smooth-talking knight tossing a gold coin onto the table like something out of a tavern ballad. The reality was far less glamorous, more humiliating, and often strangely mundane. Before anything happened, there had to be an agreement, and that meant haggling. And haggling here wasn't about a bolt of cloth or a jug of ale. It was about bodies. Prices, services, and terms had to be discussed, and it was as awkward as you imagine. A man might shuffle forward, coins clutched in a sweaty palm, and mumble an offer. The woman would weigh his appearance, the jingle of his purse, maybe even the smell of him, before deciding what she could extract. Sometimes it was straightforward. A fixed rate, a few pennies for a quick tumble, more if he wanted something beyond the usual. But more often, it was a negotiation, a back and forth where desperation met calculation. The brothel wasn't a restaurant with a printed menu. It was more like a medieval marketplace, except instead of haggling over the price of onions, you were negotiating over what you could do with your trousers off. Coins were the most obvious currency, but not the only one. Money was scarce in many parts of medieval Europe, so payment might come in the form of bread, beer, or even livestock. Imagine walking into a brothel and offering up a chicken as payment. That actually happened. A scrawny bird could buy you an hour, maybe less depending on how hungry the house was. Grain sacks, cloth scraps, even firewood could sometimes stand in for coin. If it had value in a world of constant scarcity, it had value in the brothel, and so the line between economy and intimacy blurred into something depressingly transactional. For the women, these negotiations were survival. A coin wasn't just a coin. It was food for the day, rent for the bed, maybe even the difference between life and starvation. That meant every haggling match was a small battle, fought with words, glances, and the occasional feigned indifference. If she looked too eager, the client would press for a lower price. If she looked too cold, he might walk away. Striking the right balance was a performance in itself, a dance of manipulation and necessity where the stakes were always higher for her than for him. The clients often hated this part. Some wanted to believe the fantasy that they were desired, that this was romance rather than transaction. Nothing shattered that illusion faster than being told flatly, 3 pennies or go next door. Others tried to swagger their way through, puffing out their chests, exaggerating their wealth, dropping hints about their social status. The women, unimpressed, knew better. A knight's crest didn't mean anything if his purse was light. A priest's blessing didn't pay for firewood. Charm might buy a smile, but only silver opened the door upstairs. Of course, there were those who tried to cheat. Promises of future payment were common. "I'll bring more coin next week," or "I'll pay double next time." Sometimes they promised favors, a bag of grain from the mill, a word with the local bailiff, protection from trouble in the street. But trust was a dangerous currency. Too often the favors never came. The promises vanished like smoke, and the women were left with nothing but wasted time and another hungry night. Some madams grew wise to this and demanded payment up front, refusing to negotiate with sweet-talkers or would-be conmen. In this way, the brothel mirrored the wider world. Trust was rare, betrayal was common, and everyone had to be on guard. The awkwardness was heightened by the setting. These negotiations often played out in front of others, on the benches near the fire, in the smoky lobby where ale sloshed and laughter rang out. Privacy wasn't a luxury most could afford. That meant every haggling session had an audience. Other men smirking, women rolling their eyes, the madam lurking with sharp ears. Imagine trying to negotiate the price of sex while a drunk farmer behind you belched loudly and a fiddler scraped out a tune in the corner. There was no intimacy, no softness, only public commerce dressed up in candlelight and perfume. And yet, despite the discomfort, this ritual was essential. It was the brothel's heartbeat, the moment when everything shifted from possibility to reality. The clink of coins in a palm, the nod of agreement, the subtle glance toward the stairs. This was the turning point. For the client, it was the moment desire became tangible. For the woman, it was the moment survival was secured, at least for another day. The humor of it all, if you can call it that, lay in how desperately human it was. Men stammered, women smirked, chickens squawked, and someone in the corner inevitably laughed at the wrong time. The fantasy that clients clung to, that they were heroes, lovers, seducers, crumbled under the weight of negotiation. Nothing revealed the raw truth faster than a man reduced to bartering over pennies while pretending not to care. And when it was done, when the awkward exchange finally ended, both parties carried the invisible weight of it upstairs. For him, perhaps a bruised ego, or the nagging sense that romance couldn't be purchased. For her, the quiet calculation of how many more coins were needed before rent was due, how many more nights she'd have to repeat this dance. It was less of a menu, more of a desperate haggling match. And in that transaction, the brothel revealed its truest face, not a place of fantasy or glamour, but a marketplace of flesh, where every deal came at the cost of dignity. If you think medieval brothels were nothing but candlelit whispers and silk sheets, you're about to be corrected in the bluntest way possible. Because standing by the door, arms folded across a chest that looks like it was carved out of oak and ale, was the person who really decided if you got in or got tossed into the mud. The bouncer. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, when half the population was illiterate and the other half was dying of dysentery, brothels had hired muscle. Someone had to keep the peace, or at least control the chaos enough that the house could keep raking in coins. And make no mistake, this wasn't the charming doorman with a velvet rope. This was the kind of man whose fists were the size of loaves of bread and who smelled like he'd been marinated in beer and goat fat for a week straight. He wasn't just there for intimidation. The bouncer's job was survival for the women, for the madam, and for the brothel itself. Clients didn't exactly arrive sober and polite. They came staggering in after tankards of weak ale, flushed with bravado, carrying knives on their belts and grudges in their hearts. Mix desperation, lust, and cheap alcohol in one wooden shack, and you don't get romance. You get brawls, shouts, and the occasional bloodstain that no amount of straw could cover. Someone had to make sure those fights didn't spill too far, that clients remembered to actually pay, and that no one ended up dead on the floor. That someone was the bouncer, and he did it with the subtlety of a battering ram. Picture it. A drunk farmer grabs a woman too roughly, convinced his 3 pennies bought him ownership. She pushes back. He shouts. Maybe swings an arm. In seconds, the bouncer is there, a hand like an anvil on the farmer's shoulder. No words, no warnings, just force. The next sound is usually the farmer hitting the wall, or the door, or the street outside. Lesson delivered. The brothel couldn't afford reputation problems. A dead client meant investigation, priests sniffing around, city guards demanding bribes. Better to keep the troublemakers alive but humiliated, crawling home in the muck with bruises as souvenirs. And if you thought paying your way out was optional, think again. The bouncer was also the final word in the nightly ritual of settling accounts. No money, no favors, no hen tucked under your arm as collateral, then you didn't leave until something was squared. Sometimes that meant handing over a belt, a knife, even a pair of boots. Men walked in swaggering and walked out barefoot, because in the world of the brothel, you either paid or you bled. Violence was always simmering in these places. The brothel was a pressure cooker of resentment, hunger, and shame. A noble might slum it for a thrill, throwing coins around like sparks, while a poor craftsman sat in the corner nursing a cup he couldn't afford, seething at the injustice. Fights broke out for reasons so small they were laughable. Who looked at whose girl, who drank the last ale, who muttered an insult under his breath. But once fists started flying, it was never funny. Wooden benches overturned, candles toppled, knives flashed. That's when the bouncer's real purpose showed. Not to prevent violence. He couldn't, but to end it, fast, before the whole house burned down in chaos. The women relied on him too. For all the jeers and judgment hurled at prostitutes, their work was dangerous. A client could turn violent without warning. Maybe he was drunk, maybe he was angry, maybe he just wanted to feel power in a life where he usually had none. Whatever the reason, he could lash out, and there were no police eager to protect a sex worker. The bouncer was the closest thing to law enforcement she had. His presence meant that if she screamed, someone might actually come. It wasn't justice. It was survival. Of course, this kind of man wasn't exactly saintly himself. Many bouncers had criminal pasts. Ex-soldiers too scarred for the battlefield, thugs chased out of towns, men who knew how to fight better than they knew how to farm. Their loyalty wasn't to morality, but to the madam's coin. If you crossed the house, you crossed him, and that rarely ended well. Teeth were knocked out, noses broken, ribs cracked in alleys where no one asked questions. If you limped home after a brothel visit, it wasn't always from what you paid for. The irony is that the church loathed brothels, but often tolerated bouncers. They saw them as necessary evils. Better to have violence contained inside than spilling onto the streets. City councils even wrote ordinances that allowed brothels to hire guards for protection, as if they were respectable businesses warding off thieves. In truth, the real thieves were sometimes the bouncers themselves, skimming coins, taking extra payments on the side, or demanding free services from the women. Power always came with abuse, and no one in a brothel had the luxury of expecting fairness. Still, without him, the house couldn't function. He was the wall that kept the chaos from swallowing everything whole. Men feared him, women tolerated him, the madam paid him, and everyone knew his shadow loomed large over the door. When he stood up, conversations quieted. When he cracked his knuckles, men suddenly remembered debts. And when he threw someone out, the whole room watched, half in fear, half in relief, glad it wasn't them. So yes, the brothel had a bouncer. Not for glamour, not for charm, but because in a world where lust and liquor were constant companions, someone had to be the fist that kept it all barely in check. And if you stumbled in one night without coin in your purse, swagger in your step, or respect on your tongue, you'd learn quickly what every medieval client already knew. You either paid or you bled. Step inside a medieval brothel, and the first thing you should forget is privacy. Privacy is a modern luxury, the sort of thing you take for granted when you close your bedroom door or pull your curtains shut. Here, in this house of noise and bodies, it doesn't exist. The walls are thin, if there are walls at all, and most of the rooms are simply spaces crudely divided by wooden planks, tattered cloth hangings, or, if you're especially unlucky, nothing more than the suggestion of a corner. Couples aren't retreating to velvet chambers with feather beds. They're squeezed onto straw pallets barely wide enough for one person, never mind two, surrounded by the ever-present sounds of groaning beams, dripping ale, and the muffled rhythm of the next bed over. It's communal chaos in every sense. Imagine trying to feel seductive while a drunk merchant is hiccuping through his negotiations 3 feet away, or when the madam's voice cuts across the floor, berating someone for stealing bread. The entire place hums with overlapping stories. Laughter, anger, bargaining, moaning, crying. It's less a sanctuary of passion and more like a badly run inn where no one actually sleeps, and the only thing on the menu is sweat. Even if you were determined to find romance here, the odds are against you. Unless you think rats scurrying along the rafters make excellent chaperones. The furniture is as rough as the patrons. Beds are straw-filled sacks tossed onto wooden frames, when they're not just piles of straw spread directly on the floor. Sheets, if they exist, are stiff from weeks of use, heavy with grime, and faintly sticky from spills that no one dares to identify. Pillows are a luxury too rare for most, so your head rests where it falls. On straw, on wood, sometimes on your own arm, if you're clever enough to fold it beneath you. In winter, the cold creeps in through every crack, so bodies press together, not for intimacy, but for warmth. In summer, the heat bakes the air until it feels like breathing through a damp cloth. Either way, comfort is never the goal. Function is. Curtains are the closest thing to boundaries, and they're pitiful at best. A faded sheet or an old cloak might be strung across a rope to give the illusion of seclusion, but everyone knows the truth. Sound doesn't respect fabric, nor does smell. When one man vomits into a corner bucket, the stench doesn't politely stay put. It spreads like smoke, curling beneath every curtain and lingering in your throat. When someone snores, everyone hears it. When someone screams, everyone pretends not to. The illusion of privacy is just that, a fragile veil you cling to because the alternative is admitting you are sharing your most intimate acts with a dozen strangers and their parasites. And yes, the rats are real. They live in the straw, darting between floorboards, bold enough to scurry past a bare ankle without hesitation. They're constant companions, drawn by the food scraps, the spilled ale, and the warmth of so many bodies crammed together. If you're lucky, they'll stay in the corners. If not, they'll join the bed as unwanted witnesses, tiny eyes gleaming in the candlelight. Fleas and lice, of course, are unavoidable. Every mattress, every blanket, every body is infested. Scratching is as common a sound as laughter, a background chorus of nails dragging over skin that never seems to stop itching. Noise is relentless, and silence is a rarity no coin can buy. The brothel never truly sleeps. If one room quiets, another erupts. A night boasting too loudly, a priest whispering too nervously, a woman crying too softly to draw attention but loud enough for the others to hear. The laughter of drunken men mixes with the thud of fists when arguments spiral out of control. A door slams, a chair breaks. The madam's footsteps pound against the floorboards as she storms toward trouble. There's always something happening, and none of it cares about your desire for a quiet night. For the women who live and work here, this chaos is permanent. They don't get to leave when the noise grows unbearable. They eat here, sleep here, work here, and fight off sickness here. Their downtime is spent in the same overcrowded rooms where they labor, surrounded by the same smells and the same restless movement. They talk to each other in whispers between clients, share scraps of bread, share combs riddled with lice, share despair disguised as humor. Friendships bloom, rivalries spark, but everything plays out within these same thin walls. There is no escape from one another, no solitude to cry or heal or dream. The clients don't care about the conditions. They're here for their own reasons, their own hungers. A merchant wants release before heading home to his wife. A soldier wants distraction before his next campaign. A priest comes guiltily, muttering prayers in between acts he'll condemn from the pulpit tomorrow. They step into this chaos like it's an escape, but for those who live here, it's a cage. The drunken songs might change nightly, the faces might blur, but the rhythm of communal life never shifts. Always crowded, always loud, always on display. If you think that sounds romantic, you might need to reevaluate what romance actually means. This isn't candlelight and whispered affection. This is life lived under constant scrutiny, with nothing hidden and nothing sacred. The curtains aren't privacy. The noise isn't celebration. The closeness isn't connection. It's survival, pure and raw. And if you want to imagine yourself inside, remember this. You're not stepping into a secluded boudoir. You're stepping into a human anthill, buzzing with life, packed with desperation, and utterly without silence. Romance? Not here. Not unless you count the rats. If you've ever complained about the firmness of a hotel mattress or the scratchiness of a cheap set of sheets, allow me to introduce you to the medieval brothel bed, a true masterpiece of discomfort, disease, and despair. The word furniture feels generous here. These aren't beds in the sense you know them. They're straw mattresses, if we're being charitable, stuffed into sagging sacks of cloth, sometimes reinforced with rope, and thrown on crude wooden frames that creak louder than the patrons using them. And by mattresses, what we really mean is lumps of decomposing vegetation that have been slowly compacted into a sort of itchy, bug-filled pancake. Now picture that same mattress being used by dozens, even hundreds, of people without ever being replaced. Straw wasn't cheap, not when peasants needed it for thatching roofs and feeding livestock, so every stalk in those beds had to work overtime. A good mattress might be topped up once in a while with a fresh handful of straw, but more often than not it was left to slowly rot. Over time, the material broke down, collapsing into a damp, clumpy mass. You're not lying on a cushion so much as you're lying on the collective history of everyone who came before you. Literally and figuratively, the smell tells its own story. Sweat, ale, perfume, piss, and worse have seeped into every fiber of the bedding. There's no Febreze, no bleach, no magical laundromat down the road waiting to rescue these sheets. They're washed only when the filth becomes unbearable, and washed usually means dunked into a tub of cold river water, scrubbed half-heartedly with lye, and hung in smoky air to dry. By the time you climb in, the sheets are stiff as parchment and scratchier than wool. Congratulations, you've just been exfoliated by history itself. But wait, sheets, you ask? That's a bold assumption. Many brothel beds didn't bother with sheets at all, leaving you face to face with the bare straw, which has a charming habit of poking through the sack and stabbing into your skin. Even when sheets existed, they weren't crisp and white like something from a detergent commercial. They were gray, brown, or somewhere in between, stained from years of unmentionable use, patched and repatched until they resembled more quilt than cloth. Some had been stolen from monasteries or given as charity rags by wealthy patrons eager to balance sin with generosity. No matter their origin, by the time you encountered them, they were soaked in the residue of every client who had come before. And about those beds, think of them less as private sanctuaries and more as communal relics. They're rarely reserved for one worker or one client. Instead, they're endlessly recycled. One man stumbles out, half-dressed, reeking of ale, and another stumbles in without pause. The same mattress sees a parade of bodies every night, each leaving behind sweat, spit, tears, and occasionally blood. Nothing is aired out. Nothing is reset. You slide into the indentations left behind by strangers. That warmth you feel isn't from the straw. It's from the man who was there 20 minutes ago. Parasites love these beds even more than the patrons do. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrive in the woven straw, breeding and feeding with wild abandon. Every time someone lies down, they disturb the nest, sending the creatures skittering across the body in search of fresh flesh. Itching is as much a part of the experience as anything else, and scratching continues long after the client leaves. Many customers brought home more than memories. Whole colonies of vermin hitchhiked in their clothing and hair, spreading joy to wives and neighbors alike. In some cities, inspectors supposedly checked brothels for infestations, but no one could truly eliminate them. The furniture itself was alive. Then there's the question of stability. These beds are not built to last. Nails stick out, wood splinters, and the entire frame collapses if too many people lean on it at once. A passionate evening might be punctuated not by romance but by the crash of wood giving way, sending bodies tumbling onto the dirt floor below. Patrons laughed it off if they were drunk enough, but for the workers, It was another risk to navigate in a job already full of them. Bruises and cuts were routine. Splinters were guaranteed. A bed was as likely to injure you as it was to support you. Furniture beyond the beds didn't fare much better. Benches sagged under the weight of too many patrons, stained with spilled ale and grease. Tables, if they existed at all, were sticky surfaces meant for gambling, eating, and the occasional hurried tryst. Chairs were rickety, missing legs, or patched with rope. Nothing matched. Nothing was polished. A brothel wasn't a home. It was a business, and the furnishings reflected that. The bare minimum to keep bodies inside and coin flowing across the madam's table. Every object carried its own history, and not the kind anyone wanted to remember. The mattress beneath you had absorbed decades of transactions. The bench where you sat still bore the carvings of bored clients scratching initials with knives. The curtains that passed for walls had soaked up more smoke than a chimney. Nothing was neutral. Everything smelled, stained, and sagged with evidence of what it had witnessed. But here's the real kicker. Clients expected nothing better. No one walked into a medieval brothel expecting luxury. You didn't come for silk sheets or goose feather pillows. You came for an escape, however fleeting, and you endured the filth because you had no other choice. Complaints about the furniture fell on deaf ears. The madam wasn't spending her coin on linen when she could buy more ale, more candles, or bribe the guards. Comfort was irrelevant. What mattered was volume. How many bodies could be shuffled in and out before dawn? So when you imagine lying down in a medieval brothel bed, picture this. You lower yourself onto straw that crunches beneath you. Scratch at fleas the moment your skin touches fabric. Inhale the stench of old sweat and mold, and know deep in your bones that the mattress beneath you has held thousands of bodies before yours. You are not just lying in a bed, you're lying in history. If the straw mattresses and crooked doors were the skeleton of a medieval brothel, then the noise was its blood. Step inside, and the air doesn't just reek, it vibrates. Music, shouting, dice rattling in cups, and drunken songs crash together into one relentless din that fills every corner of the building. The brothel wasn't just a place to buy sex. It was an entertainment hall, a rough-and-ready tavern, and a gambling den rolled into one. People came not only to lose their coins between the sheets, but to drown themselves in the sound of life lived too loudly, too desperately. The music set the tone, even when it was bad, and it was often bad. Minstrels sat perched on stools with battered lutes, fiddles missing strings, or pipes patched with wax. They plucked, scraped, and wheezed their way through bawdy ballads, and nobody cared if the tune was crooked. The songs were loud, dirty, and usually about drinking, fighting, or women. Some were popular enough that half the room joined in, slamming fists against the tables in rhythm, turning the brothel into something like a rowdy choir of the damned. Others were made up on the spot, with lyrics too obscene to repeat outside those walls, though inside they drew raucous laughter and coin tossed at the minstrel's feet. Ale flowed just as steadily as the music, thin, sour, and warm. Nobody was here for quality. The drink was fuel. Fuel to forget, to grow bolder, to make haggling easier and rejection sting less. It sloshed from mugs onto the tables and floor, soaking into the rushes underfoot until the room smelled like a brewery died there. Men toasted to nothing, toasted to everything, toasted because raising a tankard made them feel like kings for half a second. By midnight, half the room was stumbling, slurring words, and spilling secrets they'd deny the next day. Alcohol wasn't the background. It was the glue holding the whole sordid experience together. Without ale, the brothel would have been too raw to endure. With it, shame dissolved into laughter, and coins loosened from fists that might otherwise have stayed clenched. The games filled in the gaps between drink and music. Dice were the favorite, cheap cubes carved from bone, clattering across sticky tables while men shouted, cursed, and accused each other of cheating. The stakes were small: a handful of coins, a scrap of cloth, a promise of ale. But the tension was real. Fists slammed when luck turned sour, and more than one fight broke out over a roll. Cards, in some places, made an appearance, though dice ruled the night because you didn't need literacy to gamble with them. Watching the games was part of the fun, too. Men clustered around the table, cheering for one throw, groaning at the next, the whole room rising and falling in rhythm, with the chance of bones bouncing on wood. Entertainment was part of the draw. For many clients, the brothel wasn't just about the women. It was a social space, a break from work, a place to laugh with friends without a wife's watchful eye or a priest's sermon ringing in their ears. It was one of the few places where classes mixed. Peasants shoulder to shoulder with merchants, knights clinking mugs with butchers, even the occasional hooded priest muttering into his ale. Everyone was stripped down to the same level of rowdy, sweating, stumbling humanity. If the church condemned it, that only made it more exciting. For the price of a few pennies, you bought yourself not just sex, but an entire evening of noise, games, and drunken camaraderie. The atmosphere was relentless. Candles smoked in iron sconces, filling the air with haze. Minstrels played louder to be heard over the shouting. Women danced between the benches, laughing too loudly, draping themselves across laps to keep the mood high and the coins flowing. The madam prowled in the background, sharp eyes counting every coin while pretending not to notice the chaos. Every sense was overwhelmed. Your ears rang with music and singing, your nose choked on ale and sweat, your eyes stung from smoke, and your tongue was coated with sour drink. There was no quiet corner, no moment of peace. The brothel was a storm, and if you stayed, you were caught in it. Even when the songs wound down, the background never fully died. A minstrel strummed idly on a lute. Dice still rattled in some shadowy corner. Laughter rose and fell like waves. The noise became the medieval equivalent of background Netflix. Something constant, filling silence, reminding everyone that they weren't alone, that they were part of something bigger, even if that something was messy and shameful. For men who lived lives of drudgery in the fields or shops, the brothel's chaos felt like vibrancy, like stepping into the heart of life itself. They could pretend, for a night, that they were part of a story rather than just the backdrop of one. And for the women, the atmosphere was both tool and torment. The music kept clients lingering, drinking more, spending more, and that meant more coin for the house. But the noise never stopped. The drunken songs blurred together. The laughter grew harsh. The games ended in fights. To them, the storm wasn't entertainment. It was a constant grind, another obstacle layered on top of exhaustion. But they laughed anyway. They danced anyway. They poured ale anyway, because that was the performance expected of them. By the time dawn broke and the last tankard was drained, the atmosphere hung heavy like smoke. Minstrels packed up their lutes, dice lay forgotten on sticky tables, and men stumbled out into the cold streets, singing the last lines of bawdy ballads to no one in particular. The chaos died slowly, as if reluctant to let go, but its echo clung to the brothel walls, soaked into the beams and benches just like the ale and the sweat. So when you think of a medieval brothel, don't imagine whispered encounters in hushed chambers. Imagine a tavern that never shuts up, where drunken voices rise over bad music, where dice rattle endlessly, where ale spills until the floor sticks to your boots, and where romance is nothing more than another sound swallowed by the storm. If you strip away the smoke, the perfume, and the noise, what's left at the heart of a medieval brothel isn't passion or romance. It's money. Every groan, every laugh, every clink of a tankard is ultimately about coin. The brothel was never just a house of pleasure. It was a business, one that operated on margins as thin as the sheets on its beds, and yet somehow managed to keep the wheels of the city turning. It may have been condemned from the pulpit, But down in the counting rooms of town halls and treasuries, it was something else entirely. Taxable. Your sin is taxable. Thank you very much. The flow of money began with the client, stumbling in from the street with a purse on his hip. Whatever he brought, pennies, chickens, sacks of grain, it all trickled upward. A client never paid the woman directly without someone else taking notice. The madam was the broker, and she took her cut first, always. If a man handed over 3 pennies, 1 went to the woman, 2 went into the madam's chest. If it was a loaf of bread or a jug of wine, the woman might get a bite, but the bulk of it was redistributed as the madam saw fit. She was the gatekeeper of all income, and every deal was carefully recorded in her mental ledger, if not on parchment. From there, the money didn't simply sit. The brothel itself owed dues. Taxes to the city, bribes to officials, donations to the church when moral outrage grew too loud. All of it had to be paid. City governments knew exactly how lucrative these places were, and they were more than willing to skim off the top. Some towns openly licensed brothels, issuing permits and charging annual fees. Others pretended to scorn them in public while quietly sending tax collectors to the madam's door. In both cases, the message was clear. Sin was profitable, and the city wanted its share. Bribes were just as essential as taxes. Guards, inspectors, and bailiffs expected to be paid for their silence or their cooperation. A brothel couldn't survive without greasing palms. If the city wanted to shut a house down, they could do so overnight on charges of disturbing the peace or corrupting morality. But a pouch of coins slipped into the right hand kept the law conveniently blind. Officials might thunder in public about filth and shame, but in private, they were more than happy to take their cut. Some even charged inspection fees, visiting houses under the guise of moral oversight and leaving with heavier purses. Hypocrisy was expensive, but everyone understood the cost of doing business. The church played its own part, and its relationship with brothels was nothing short of bizarre. Officially, prostitution was a sin, a stain on the soul that dragged whole communities toward damnation. Unofficially, churches tolerated or even managed brothels in certain cities, justifying them as necessary evils that protected honorable women from lustful men. And of course, the church took its cut too, sometimes through taxes, sometimes through penances paid by madams eager to avoid sermons aimed directly at their doors. Priests might spit fire from the pulpit, but the collection plate made no distinctions about the source of coin. For the women, this financial web meant that their actual earnings were meager. A client might pay a generous sum, but by the time the madam took her share, the city levied its tax, the guards claimed their bribes, and the church received its donation. The woman herself saw only scraps. Many lived perpetually in debt to the house, borrowing against future work to pay for food, clothing, or medicine. Debts were added to ledgers, inflated by interest, and used to trap women indefinitely. It was a system designed to ensure they rarely escaped, that their bodies kept producing revenue long after their will had worn thin. Yet despite the misery, brothels were economic engines. They generated jobs beyond the women themselves. Brewers supplied the ale, bakers the bread, musicians the songs, tailors the costumes, and guards the muscle. Money spent in a brothel flowed outward into the city economy, touching almost every trade. Towns knew this, and that's why so many tolerated these houses despite moral outrage. A closed brothel didn't just mean fewer sins. It meant fewer coins in circulation, fewer bribes to collect, fewer merchants selling their goods. Sin, in this sense, was not only taxable, it was indispensable. Some brothels became institutions, their revenue streams so steady that city councils relied on them like they relied on tolls or market fees. Records show towns earmarking brothel income for repairs to walls, bridges, and even churches. Imagine kneeling in a chapel rebuilt on the back of brothel taxes, the priest thundering against lust beneath a roof, literally paid for by it. The contradiction was glaring, but in the pragmatism of medieval life, it barely raised eyebrows. Survival mattered more than consistency. Of course, the clients never saw this machinery. To them, the price was just the price. An awkward haggling session. A few coins slipped across a table, and the illusion that their transaction was private. But the reality was that their money set off a chain reaction, passing from the woman to the madam, to the city, and beyond. A single drunken night could end up funding not just the brothel's coffers, but also the city watch, a bishop's new vestments, and a mason repairing a bridge. Their lust, in other words, was part of the infrastructure. The irony is suffocating. The same officials who condemned brothels depended on their revenue. The same priests who thundered against lust in sermons spent tithes collected from its profits. And the same city leaders who passed laws restricting prostitutes' clothing relied on their coins to patch the city walls. Sin wasn't just tolerated, it was built into the economy. A hidden gear turning beneath the righteous surface of society. So when you picture a medieval brothel, don't just see the women and their clients. Picture the madam with her iron grip on the purse strings. Picture the guard taking his bribe, the priest pocketing his penance, the taxman scribbling figures into his ledger. Picture the city itself, leaning on the brothel's crooked walls for support, too hypocritical to admit it, but too dependent to let it collapse. In the end, brothels weren't just dens of lust. They were banks, treasuries, and tax farms disguised in lace and candlelight. Every laugh, every kiss, every groan was another coin slipping into the pockets of people who pretended to despise it. And the truth is this: in the Middle Ages, morality could be preached from pulpits all day long, but when it came to money, sin was just another revenue stream. If coins were the lifeblood of the brothel, gifts were its strange, glittering pulse. Not every client walked in with a purse full of pennies jingling at his belt. Money was scarce in a world where most people survived on barter. And besides, some men preferred to pay in ways that felt less like a financial transaction and more like flattery. Jewelry, food, scraps of fabric, even shoes. These could all pass for payment if they pleased the madam or kept a woman fed for another day. The brothel wasn't picky about the form so long as value was there. In the end, it all boiled down to the same thing. You paid one way or another. Jewelry was the most obvious substitute for coin, though jewelry is a generous term. Clients rarely strolled in with gold necklaces or sapphire rings. More often it was trinkets, a copper brooch, a pewter pendant, glass beads that imitated gems. A merchant might hand over a silver clasp pilfered from his stockpile, or a knight might leave behind a dagger with a decorated hilt. Sometimes these gifts were genuine. Often they were gaudy imitations. But it didn't matter. The women wore them anyway, partly as decoration, partly as silent advertisement of what they could coax out of a man besides his money. Each necklace and bracelet was not just ornament. It was evidence of survival. Food was another common currency, and perhaps more useful. A client might arrive with a loaf of bread tucked under his arm, a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth, or a jug of wine. In a household where hunger was constant, these items were treasures, immediately divided among the women, or tucked away by the madam for leaner nights. It wasn't romantic to be paid with half a pig's leg, but hunger cared little for romance. A warm stew meant more than a shiny trinket, and a jug of wine could fuel laughter long after the coins were gone. Food as payment also carried a different kind of intimacy. The man wasn't just buying flesh, he was keeping women alive. The line between transaction and charity blurred, though everyone knew which side it really fell on. Clothing, too, changed hands in these exchanges. Men gave cloaks, boots, or bits of cloth as gifts, sometimes because they genuinely wanted to provide, more often because they had nothing else to spare. A cloak worn thin in the rain might still be better than nothing. Bright fabric scraps could be stitched into bodices or shawls, helping the women maintain the illusion of glamour their profession demanded. It was less about elegance and more about necessity. You might not get a goose feather pillow, but a wool cloak draped across your shoulders was something tangible, something you could wrap around yourself in the biting cold. But not every gift was meant for the women. Many of these offerings went straight to the madam, who had her own system of favors and bribes to manage. A jug of wine might pacify a city guard who came sniffing around. A piece of jewelry could be pawned for coin to bribe a tax collector, and food could be sent to curry favor with local officials. Corruption was baked into the system so deeply that every transaction had echoes far beyond the brothel walls. A loaf of bread might end up on a bailiff's table. A ring might glint on a taxman's finger. What began as a gift to a prostitute became another cog in the machinery that kept the brothel alive. The gifts also acted as a kind of currency of affection, though everyone understood the lie in that. A client might bring a ribbon or a necklace, insisting it meant more than money, whispering promises of love to the woman he favored. She might smile, might wear the ribbon in her hair, might play along for as long as he kept returning. But the truth was always clear. Affection was just another form of transaction. The jewelry was payment disguised as sentiment, a tip dressed up as romance, and once the man's money, or his gifts, ran out, so did the illusion. There was also danger in these gifts. A woman who wore too many trinkets risked the jealousy of her peers or the wrath of the madam, who always kept track of what went where. A favor accepted outside the madam's watchful eye could mean punishment, even expulsion. Gifts from clients could be seen as loyalty to the house, or as theft from it, depending on who was judging. The line was never clear. What one woman thought was kindness might be tallied against her as debt. In the brothel, everything was counted, and nothing was free. Clients understood this system too, and some exploited it. A man with little money but access to resources, a miller with sacks of flour, a shepherd with wool, a brewer with ale, could leverage those goods as bribes, ensuring the madam's goodwill. Others used gifts to soften debts, offering jewelry or food when they couldn't cover the cost in coin. It wasn't always enough, but sometimes it bought leniency. The madam might look the other way once or twice, but never forever. Eventually, the reckoning came, and gifts could only stall it. And yet, despite the grim mechanics, gifts had their own strange allure. For the women, wearing a necklace or receiving a loaf of bread felt like acknowledgement that they weren't just bodies for rent. It was proof, however fleeting, that someone saw them as worth giving to. The jewelry might be cheap, the bread stale, the ribbon fraying, but in a world that offered them so little, even scraps felt like tokens of worth. For one night at least, they could imagine the gesture meant something beyond survival. But illusions fade quickly in the brothel. Jewelry tarnished, food spoiled, cloaks wore thin. The real economy remained the same. The madam took her cut, the officials got their bribes, and the women were left with whatever scraps remained. Gifts were simply another mask, another form of currency dressed up in sentiment, corruption, or necessity. Whether it was a coin, a loaf, or a brooch, it always ended in the same place, in the pockets of those who controlled the system. So when you picture a medieval brothel, don't just imagine coins sliding across tables. Imagine necklaces pawed over by tax collectors, bread disappearing into the hands of guards, and ribbons fluttering in the hair of women who knew exactly what they were worth and exactly how little that meant. Gifts were tips, bribes, distractions, but never free. In the end, whether you paid in silver, bread, or love, the cost was always collected. You paid one way or another. On Sunday mornings, the church bells rang across the cobbled streets, summoning the faithful to kneel on cold stone floors and listen to thunderous warnings about sin. The priests would raise their voices, eyes blazing as they condemned lust, greed, and the corruption of the flesh. And somewhere in that fire and brimstone litany, the brothel always appeared. It was a den of vice, they proclaimed, a cesspool dragging men's souls toward damnation. Prostitutes were the very embodiment of temptation, walking snares set by the devil himself. Congregants murmured prayers, crossed themselves, nodded solemnly. But as the last hymn faded and the church doors opened, the very same men who had bowed their heads in fear of eternal fire walked straight into the alleys where brothels thrived, coins already warming in their palms. The hypocrisy was staggering, yet it was so ordinary no one thought it strange. Condemnation in the morning, indulgence by night. That was the rhythm of medieval life. Brothels were never truly underground. They were tolerated, regulated, and in some places even run by civic or church authorities who preferred vice kept in one place rather than spilling into respectable homes. Priests and monks were among the customers, cloaked and hooded, whispering apologies to heaven even as they crossed the brothel threshold. Some justified it by claiming they were weak men wrestling with temptation. Others argued that visiting prostitutes was a lesser evil, a way to avoid corrupting good women. Whatever the excuse, the practice was common enough that everyone knew. The church's official stance was merciless. Prostitutes were sinners, men who visited them were sinners, and society itself was imperiled by their existence. Preachers painted lurid images of hellfire, awaiting those who sought pleasure in brothel beds, warning that disease and damnation were the twin rewards of lust. But behind the scenes, pragmatism reigned. The same officials who decried these houses from the pulpit also benefited from their taxes and bribes. A tidy sum from the madam's coffers could be rebranded as penance or donation, and suddenly the wrath of heaven was mollified for another month. The contradiction was glaring, but it was also profitable. Everyone knew priests were regular patrons. It wasn't even whispered. It was accepted. The sight of a tonsured head bowed in the candlelight of a brothel room wasn't shocking. It was predictable. Some priests were careful, keeping their hoods low, slipping coins discreetly, avoiding eye contact. Others flaunted it, boasting about their visits to their fellow clergy with the same bravado as a knight talking of battle scars. Monks, sworn to chastity, often strayed into brothels when traveling between monasteries, their vows unraveling under the lure of ale and flesh. They confessed the next day, of course, reciting prayers and fasting as penance, only to return again the following week. Confession itself became part of the cycle. A man could stumble from the brothel at dawn, reeking of ale and sweat, and present himself before a priest that very morning, murmuring contrition. The priest might assign a dozen Hail Marys, perhaps a coin for the poor, and declare the man absolved. And then, when the booth was empty, that same priest might visit the brothel himself before nightfall. Confess your sins in the morning, commit them at night. It was less a paradox than a routine, baked into the rhythm of the city as firmly as market days and feast days. For the women inside the brothel, the hypocrisy was a bitter truth. They knew the faces of their clients, knew which mouths had cursed them from the pulpit, and which hands had pressed coins into their palms. They laughed about it among themselves, bitterly, scornfully. When a priest visited, some treated him with exaggerated deference, mocking his sermons by asking for blessings as he unlaced his robe. Others spat after he left, sickened by the way men wielded holiness as both weapon and excuse. But they accepted the coins because survival demanded it, and survival never cared about hypocrisy. The irony ran deeper still. In many towns, brothel revenues went straight into church coffers. Taxes collected from these houses funded the very institutions that condemned them. Chapels repaired, altars gilded, candles lit, all with money born of sin. The faithful knelt to pray in spaces built partly on the backs of women the priests damned. It was a system so twisted it could only have survived because everyone agreed to look away, denounce loudly, profit quietly, and keep the whole machine turning. Some churchmen even argued that brothels served a higher purpose. Better for lust to be contained in these houses of shame they claimed, than to risk defiling wives, daughters, or virgins. The prostitute became a scapegoat, a sacrifice offered to preserve the purity of society. She was both despised and needed, cursed and paid, damned and indispensable. The men who visited could frame their indulgence not as sin, but as prevention. They weren't corrupting good women. They were using bad ones for the greater good. The logic was grotesque, but it was effective enough to keep consciences quiet. This duplicity infected every level of society. The laity echoed the clergy, condemning prostitutes in public while indulging in their services in private. Women gossiped about the sinfulness of their neighbors, even as their husbands disappeared into the brothel district at night. Children were warned never to stray near those wicked alleys, though they all knew someone's father who went there anyway. Sin was both spectacle and secret, condemned loudly, but woven so tightly into daily life, it could never be removed. The sermons thundered, the coins clinked, the doors opened and closed. Hypocrisy wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system. The church needed brothels as much as the brothels needed the church, and both thrived on the uneasy balance of condemnation and indulgence. For every soul terrified of damnation, there was a priest ready to offer absolution for a price. For every denunciation of lust, there was a hooded figure slipping into the night. The truth was as simple as it was ugly. Brothels were the shadow side of sanctity, tolerated precisely because they kept the illusion of purity intact elsewhere. The men in robes may have called it sin, but they also called it necessary. They may have warned of hellfire, but they made sure to collect their share of its revenue. And as long as the bells kept ringing, the sermons kept thundering, and the coins kept flowing, nothing ever changed. Because in the medieval world, holiness was preached from the altar, but hypocrisy paid the bills. You step into a medieval brothel, candlelight flickering against warped beams, laughter curling out of smoky corners, the smell of ale and sweat thick in the air. Everything looks alive. Too alive, in fact. But beneath the noise, there's another current running, quieter and deadlier, carried on every kiss, every groan, every exchange of flesh for coin. Disease. Not the cough from winter's chill, not the fever from spoiled food, but the particular rot that follows lust wherever it hides. In an age without antibiotics, without even the faintest idea of bacteria, medieval brothels were incubators for infections that spread like wildfire and ruined lives long after the candles were snuffed. They didn't even have names for all of it at first. Gonorrhea was known by euphemisms: the clap, the burning, the shameful drip no man wanted to admit. Syphilis, though it likely arrived in Europe at the tail end of the 15th century, earned the infamous nickname the French disease, though the French, naturally, called it the Neapolitan disease, and the Italians blamed it on the Spanish. No one wanted ownership of this horror, so they flung it at each other like mud. The truth, of course, was that it belonged to everyone. In towns where brothels thrived, it seeped through walls, down alleys, across borders. It didn't discriminate. Priests, peasants, knights, all of them carried its mark. The symptoms were as cruel as they were unmistakable. The drip of gonorrhea, the sores of syphilis, the fevers that wouldn't break. For men, pain came first, in urination that burned like fire, in boils and rashes that spread no matter how much ale they poured down to forget it. For women, the suffering was quieter, hidden, often blamed on their own supposed sinfulness. Many lived with constant pain, pelvic infections, even infertility, though no one connected the dots. Instead, the blame was always laid on the women themselves, branded as corrupters of men, even when those men had brought the sickness in the door with them. And then came syphilis. In its early stages, it could look like nothing more than a sore, a blemish brushed off as irritation. But then it advanced, attacking skin, bone, even the brain. Faces collapsed under ulcerating flesh, noses rotted away, joints twisted, and minds unraveled in madness. Victims wandered the streets with lesions across their bodies, living proof of the brothel's hidden cost. You didn't just risk a night of scratching, you risked disfigurement, insanity, and death drawn out in slow, relentless agony. The treatments were worse than the disease. Doctors, if you can call them that, prescribed mercury ointments, rubbed into sores, or swallowed in doses that poisoned the body faster than the infection itself. The logic was simple and horrifying. Mercury made you sweat and salivate, so surely it was purging the sickness from within. In reality, it eroded teeth, burned throats, and scarred skin, leaving patients drooling, trembling, and still diseased. A night with Venus, the old saying went. A lifetime with Mercury. Bloodletting was another favorite cure, draining patients of what little strength they had left while the infection raged on unchecked. Herbal concoctions, charms, prayers. None of it worked. The disease laughed at all of them, chewing through bodies while men insisted salvation was just another ointment away. Inside the brothel, disease was both constant and inescapable. A man might leave boasting of his conquest, but weeks later he was pissing blood and cursing the very woman he'd paid. She, meanwhile, was left to keep working, spreading, and receiving in equal measure, because there was no option to stop. If she refused, she starved. If she continued, she carried the sickness to every man who entered. It was a cycle without end, a chain reaction of lust and desperation that spared no one. Rumors grew around it, as rumors always do when science fails. Some claimed disease came from bad air, carried in fog, or the stench of crowded streets. Others swore it was God's punishment, a physical mark of spiritual corruption. Priests preached that prostitutes were vessels of sin, their bodies poisoned as warnings to all who dared to touch them. Men, conveniently, were portrayed as victims rather than accomplices. A man limping with sores was a poor soul led astray. A woman with the same symptoms was evidence of wickedness incarnate. Hypocrisy didn't just run through the sermons. It ran through the medicine itself. And yet, for all the horror, the brothel never emptied. Men kept coming, even when they knew the risk, because desire outweighed fear. They joked about it, turned it into dark humor, compared scars like badges of shame. Everyone knew someone who had caught something. Everyone whispered about it. But still, the doors stayed open. Still, the straw mattresses sagged with use. Lust proved stronger than caution, and so the disease spread, invisible and unstoppable, until whole towns carried its scars. For the women, there was no escape. Their bodies bore the brunt, their reputations the blame, their lives the shortest. Many died in their 20s or 30s, worn down by endless childbirth, infection, and disease. Some wasted away under mercury treatments, trembling and rotting as their clients moved on to healthier bodies. Their graves were shallow, their names forgotten, but their suffering built the very economy that towns thrived on. Cities taxed the brothel doors while ignoring the deathbed whispers behind them. If you want to know the odds of surviving medieval STDs, they weren't good. Without treatment, syphilis ate through your body until nothing remained. With treatment, mercury poisoned you slowly, while the disease kept gnawing anyway. Gonorrhea lingered, scarred, and crippled fertility. Every encounter in a brothel was a gamble not just with reputation, but with life itself. And unlike dice games or card tables, the house almost always won. So when you imagine stepping into that smoky, noisy, overcrowded building, remember what really waited in the shadows. Not just lust, not just laughter, not just ale, disease, invisible, patient, merciless. It clung to the straw, to the sheets, to every embrace, every kiss, every careless moment of desire. You thought you were buying pleasure. What you might have really bought was madness, disfigurement, and an early grave. In the end, the brothel promised escape. What it often delivered was a slow death disguised as passion. Step inside a medieval brothel, and the first thing that strikes you, after the noise and the smoke, is the smell. It's overwhelming, impossible to ignore, a living thing that clings to your clothes and crawls into your nose until you taste it. Hygiene wasn't just neglected in these places, it was almost non-existent. Water was scarce, baths were rare, and when bodies pressed together in the heat of straw-filled rooms, what you got wasn't romance. It was filth, layered and baked into every corner. The Middle Ages had a complicated relationship with water. People feared it, believed it carried disease, and avoided bathing too often lest they weaken the body. Some towns had bathhouses, true, but they were often considered just as scandalous as brothels themselves, with the added risk of being shut down when plague broke out. So washing became something of a luxury, reserved for the wealthy or the desperate. For the women in brothels, daily scrubbing was out of the question. Water was too precious, tubs too costly, and soap, a harsh, lye-heavy concoction, was more likely to burn skin than cleanse it. What passed for cleaning was often a quick wipe with a rag dipped in cold water, maybe scented with herbs if you were lucky. The sheets and bedding were another nightmare. Washing them was not a regular practice. In fact, it was rarely done at all. Straw mattresses weren't emptied unless they had collapsed into flat, moldy pancakes, and the sheets, when they existed, absorbed years of sweat, semen, ale, and worse. They were beaten with sticks to knock out the lice, maybe hung by a smoky fire to kill the worst of the stench. But true cleanliness was impossible. Clients rolled into beds where dozens had been before them, surrounded by the stale, greasy perfume of everyone else's sins. You weren't just lying with one person. You were lying with history, and history was damp, itchy, and crawling with fleas. Attempts at remedies existed, though they were equal parts hopeful and horrifying. Vinegar rinses were popular, splashed across skin, or poured into basins as a crude disinfectant. The sharp tang of vinegar masked odors for a time, but it couldn't erase disease or dirt. Herbs like rosemary, lavender, or mint were rubbed into hair or tucked into bodices, meant to ward off lice and disguise the scent of unwashed flesh. Sometimes women chewed parsley or sage to freshen breath, though rotten teeth betrayed them anyway. Perfumes were used when available. Cheap concoctions of rosewater, musk, or ambergris, but in a room saturated with ale and smoke, they simply layered sweetness over sweat until the result was sickly. Clients weren't any cleaner. They came straight from fields, workshops, or taverns, carrying the grime of their trades with them. A smith reeked of ash and iron, a tanner of piss and rotting hides, a farmer of manure and animals. Bathing before a brothel visit was unthinkable. They arrived as they were, boots caked in mud, clothes stiff with weeks of dirt, and dropped themselves onto mattresses that only grew filthier with every passing night. The clash of odors was part of the experience, tolerated if not ignored. Ale dulled the senses, dim candlelight blurred the details, and desire, or at least desperation, bridged the rest. The lack of hygiene had consequences, and everyone knew it. Skin infections spread easily in such close quarters. Lice were rampant, nesting in hair and bedding, leaving angry welts that never healed. Fleas jumped from straw to skin, carrying not only irritation, but sometimes plague. Women developed sores, rashes, and constant itching that no herb could cure. Men walked away scratching furiously, their pride intact but their skin in revolt. Worse were the festering wounds, untreated cuts and boils that lingered and worsened in the filth. In a world where even minor infections could kill, the brothel was a perfect breeding ground for sickness. And then there were the attempts at medical prevention, most of which caused more harm than help. Some women applied ointments of mercury or lead, convinced these substances could protect against disease. Others drank concoctions of wine mixed with herbs, hoping to cleanse themselves from within. None of it worked. If anything, the remedies hastened illness. Mercury burned skin, lead poisoned blood, herbs caused nausea, and yet they persisted because the alternative was to do nothing at all. Congratulations, you now glow in the dark. Because you're infected. Despite the obvious dangers, the system carried on because there was no alternative. Soap was too expensive, water too risky, and true sanitation an impossible dream. The women laughed bitterly about the filth, joked about their lice as if naming them made them less real, and perfumed themselves with crushed herbs to keep the illusion alive. The clients played along, pretending not to notice the smells, focusing on the fantasy rather than the reality of the damp, grimy beds. Everyone knew the truth, but to acknowledge it outright would have spoiled the fragile bargain that kept coins flowing and bellies fed. The irony was that some towns officially regulated brothels under the guise of protecting public health. Officials mandated inspections, demanded that the women wash periodically, even ordered the burning of bedding in times of plague. But these measures were half-hearted, poorly enforced, and often ignored. The very people meant to enforce them were the same ones being bribed at the door or visiting the brothels themselves. Rules existed on parchment, reality existed in filth. So the brothel endured, rank and unwashed, its walls steeped in centuries of sweat and smoke. Hygiene wasn't absent out of negligence. It was absent out of poverty, out of ignorance, out of a system where survival always mattered more than cleanliness. To walk through those doors was to step into a world where the stench clung to you like a second skin, where sheets whispered of every body that came before, and where remedies reeked as badly as the problems they failed to solve. Romance, intimacy, cleanliness, those were fantasies sold to dull the truth. What the brothel really offered was escape in spite of the filth. A moment of forgetting carved out of an environment that never let you forget anything. The women endured it, the clients ignored it, and the madam profited from it, because the one rule of the medieval brothel was simple. No matter how filthy it was, the business never stopped. The brothel was never just a house of sex. It was a house of survival, and survival in the Middle Ages rarely came clean. Violence threaded through every timber, every alley leading to its crooked door, every coin exchanged across the madam's table. Lust drew men in, but chaos lingered close behind. When you mix ale, desperation, and bodies for sale, you don't get romance. You get a powder keg, and it didn't take much. A spilled drink, a lost dice game, an insult muttered under the breath, for it all to explode into shouting, fists, and blood on the floor. Drunken fights were as much a part of brothel life as the candle smoke and the stink of sweat. Men staggered in from taverns already half gone, brimming with liquid courage, and treated the house like an extension of the street. A knight might shove a merchant, a peasant might swing at a farmer, or a priest might hiss threats when someone laughed too loudly at his expense. Benches overturned, tankards shattered, knives came out far more often than anyone liked to admit. The bouncer, hulking and brutal, could throw men into the mud outside, but he couldn't stop the violence entirely. Sometimes it spilled into the rooms, leaving women caught in the middle of chaos they hadn't asked for but couldn't escape. And then there were the pimps, though the term wasn't coined in the way we know it now. Still, the role existed. Men who lurked around brothels, exploiting women further, demanding cuts of their coin in exchange for protection. Some were lovers turned parasites. Others were thugs who saw vulnerable women and moved in to control them. They tightened debts, demanded loyalty, and punished defiance with fists or worse. A woman might owe money to the madam for food or clothing, but she also owed her body and coin to a man who claimed ownership over her. Shackled twice over, she had nowhere to turn, because the city guard wasn't interested in saving prostitutes from the men who bled them dry. Forced prostitution was no myth. Many women entered brothels by choice, only in the loosest sense. Poverty, hunger, and desperation gave them little option. Others were coerced outright. Orphans sold into service, debtors forced to work off obligations they could never repay, captives taken in war and funneled into houses of pleasure rather than graves. The madam might call it business, the clients might call it sin, but for many women, it was slavery in all but name. Beatings were common for those who resisted, and starvation was a weapon just as cruel as the fist. A woman who tried to escape could be hunted down, dragged back, and made an example of to the others. Her body wasn't hers. It was property. Robbery was a constant threat too. Drunken men flashed purses heavy with coin, and not all of them left with what they brought in. Sometimes it was other clients who took advantage, slipping knives into belts and cutting strings in the shadows. Sometimes it was the brothel itself, where the madam and her muscle relieved men of extra coin before shoving them back into the street. Who could complain? A man caught at a brothel wasn't going to march to the guardhouse to report theft. His shame was silence, and silence kept the thieves safe. Women were robbed as well, forced to hand over their meager wages to pimps or thugs, stripped of what little comfort they had managed to scrape together. The brothel became a natural hub for crime because it was already shrouded in secrecy. Deals were struck in back rooms, information traded between whispers. A thief might fence stolen goods through a madam. A smuggler might use the house as a meeting point, and assassins might find work by listening to drunken clients ramble about enemies and debts. Corruption festered here, safe under the cover of lust and vice. The authorities knew, of course, but their palms were greased with bribes, and as long as the violence didn't spill too loudly into the streets, they let it pass. The brothel was useful. It gathered the worst of the city into one place where it could be watched, taxed, and exploited. For the women, exploitation never ended. They endured the fists of angry clients, the control of pimps, the cruelty of madams, and the indifference of guards. Their bodies bore the marks of beatings, their voices silenced by fear of retaliation. If they were robbed, it was their fault for tempting thieves. If they were assaulted, it was their fault for being there. If they died, it was as though they had never existed. Prostitutes were disposable, easily replaced by the next starving girl desperate enough to take her place. The city could afford to lose them, because for every woman discarded, another was waiting in the shadows of poverty. The brothel promised pleasure but delivered danger. Clients risked their purses, their pride, their skin. Women risked everything. Survival depended on compliance, on enduring the blows, on scraping together enough coin to eat while watching others profit from their suffering. And through it all, the crime flourished, hiding behind the mask of entertainment. When the fights broke out, when the knives flashed, when the women screamed, no one outside the brothel came to help. This was expected, tolerated, absorbed into the life of the city. The noise of violence never left the brothel. It clung to its walls, echoing in the cracks, lingering in the eyes of the women who had seen too much and had nowhere else to go. It was not an accident. It was the system. And as long as coins kept changing hands, no one cared what was broken in the process. The truth was simple. The medieval brothel wasn't just a marketplace of flesh, it was a marketplace of crime. Every stolen purse, every forced body, every fist against a cheek was part of its economy, woven into the structure as firmly as the ale and the dice. It wasn't only sin being sold here. It was violence, corruption, and exploitation parceled out one night at a time. If you believe the poets, lust in the Middle Ages was all moonlight sonnets, knights sighing beneath balconies, and noble ladies swooning at the sound of lute strings. Courtly love was painted as a kind of sacred theater, where desire was noble, suffering for love was virtuous, and every embrace carried the perfume of roses. The reality, however, was sitting just down the alley from the church, wedged between the butcher's shop and the tannery. in a smoke-stained building that reeked of sweat, piss, and desperation. The contrast could not have been sharper. One was fantasy gilded in verse, the other was survival on a straw mattress. This wasn't Shakespeare. It's a mud-splattered tavern with lice. Courtly love was, in many ways, propaganda. It gave the upper classes a story to tell themselves, a narrative that made desire seem refined and spiritual. Troubadours sang of unattainable women. Knights pledged eternal devotion for nothing more than a favor, and ladies were painted as distant goddesses whose touch could redeem a man's soul. These tales were recited in castles, not in brothels. They belonged to a world of silks and feasts, not one of broken doors and spilled ale. And yet, the men who listened to those songs by day were often the same ones staggering into brothels at night, exchanging lofty vows for crude haggling and a quick release. The brothel had no use for fantasy. Women here were not mistresses of chivalric devotion. They were laborers, enduring the grunt and sweat of men too drunk or too tired to remember their names. They did not sit by windows waiting for serenades. They worked in smoke-filled rooms where dice rattled, benches overturned, and fleas leapt from straw to skin. The air wasn't scented with roses, but with vinegar, sweat, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. A knight might arrive with poetry in his head, but the moment he crossed the threshold, his illusions shattered. The woman he found waiting was not a goddess in silk. She was a girl in patched linen, exhausted, scratching at lice, bargaining for another meal's worth of coin. The romanticized Lady of the Night was a convenient fiction, painted in verse to disguise the rawness of sex work with a sheen of mystery. Writers described prostitutes as exotic, alluring, dangerous enchantresses who lured men astray with their beauty. In reality, most were thin from hunger, their faces marked by disease, their hair tangled and dulled by lack of washing. Their beauty was real in some cases, but it was worn down by use, by hardship, by the endless grind of a life lived in public shame. They weren't temptresses wielding power. They were women clawing for survival in a system that exploited them at every turn. And the men knew this, though they preferred to pretend otherwise. To cast prostitutes as seductresses allowed men to frame themselves as victims of temptation rather than participants in exploitation. It was easier to say, "I was lured," than to admit, "I paid for what I wanted." Fantasy softened the truth, gave it a story that could be laughed about later. Reality was far uglier. Men stumbled out not touched by goddesses, but by women who had no choice but to endure them. Women whose hands smelled of ale and sweat rather than rosewater. Women who were too exhausted to play the role of muse even if they wanted to. The gulf between the myths of love and the truth of brothel life showed the desperation of a society trying to reconcile lust with morality. Songs celebrated desire, but sermons condemned it. Courtly love exalted women as untouchable ideals, while brothels reduced them to commodities traded for pennies. Romance belonged to parchment and performance. Reality belonged to smoke-filled rooms where the noise of dice drowned out any whispered endearment. For the women, the contrast was especially cruel. They heard the songs too. They knew the stories of noble ladies courted with flowers and vows, but their lives were lived in alleys, not gardens. Their bodies bore bruises, not jewels. If they were spoken of in verse, it was not as objects of worship but as warnings of sin. The fantasy of devotion was never meant for them. They were the foil, the shadow against which true love could be painted bright. Their role in culture was to remind everyone what happened when love fell from grace into lust, and yet it was their bodies that kept that same culture afloat. The irony was relentless. Men declared eternal love to their wives in the language of troubadours, then visited prostitutes in the language of coins and threats. Clergy praised purity from the pulpit, then slipped into brothels with hoods drawn low. Poets described passion as sacred fire, but what most people experienced was more like a candle sputtering in a drafty room. It was a society at war with itself, caught between ideals that elevated desire to heaven and realities that dragged it through the muck of taverns and straw mattresses. The brothel didn't care about ideals. It cared about payment. It was where fantasy ended and flesh began, where lofty promises dissolved into the stink of sweat and the shuffle of dice. Every time a man walked through its doors, he left his chivalric illusions at the threshold. Inside, there was no poetry, no balcony scenes, no roses pressed between pages. There was only the sound of coins clinking, the scrape of benches, and the muttered curses of men too drunk to keep their balance. And yet, perhaps the greatest tragedy was how much people needed the fantasy to survive the reality. Courtly love gave them an ideal to cling to, a story to believe in when the truth was too filthy to face. The brothel, for all its squalor, relied on that same contrast. The more society painted prostitutes as dangerous enchantresses, the easier it became to blame them for men's sins. The myths provided cover for the hypocrisy, a way to keep the two worlds, fantasy and reality, from colliding too visibly. But if you want the truth, strip away the songs and the sonnets, forget the knights and the roses. The medieval brothel wasn't a stage for romance. It was a mud-splattered tavern with lice, where the poetry of love gave way to the economics of survival. And once you crossed that threshold, no ballad could disguise what really happened in the flicker of candlelight. If the brothel was a place of sweat and smoke, it was also a place of sound. Not just the dice clattering across sticky tables, or the off-key strum of a minstrel, but the constant hum of jokes, songs, and the kind of slang that could make even the most hardened priest blush. For all the violence, disease, and filth that clung to its walls, laughter was just as constant, a crude kind of music that made the misery tolerable. Men and women alike leaned into it, because when your life was soaked in desperation, humor was the one currency you could spend freely. And if you think medieval dirty jokes have lost their punch after centuries, spoiler, medieval dirty jokes are still funny. The humor was always ribald, crude, and aimed directly below the belt. A minstrel might launch into a ballad about a knight's sword being unsheathed in a maiden's scabbard, and the entire room would roar with laughter. Another song would tell of a miller's daughter who charged men in flour sacks rather than coins, or of a monk who found his rosary put to better use in a woman's bed. The wordplay was constant, and no metaphor was too obvious or too clumsy to be reused. Euphemism wasn't about subtlety, it was about exaggeration, about finding a way to make sex sound even filthier by dressing it up in ridiculous imagery. Nicknames for sex acts circulated like folklore, changing from town to town but always recognizable. A roll in the hay might literally mean that, since straw pallets were the setting of most encounters, riding the horse was a common phrase, though horses probably smelled better than most clients. Drinking songs twisted into parodies of prayer, turning sacred chants into bawdy verses about raising the holy staff or confessing sins between a woman's thighs. What seems shocking is how familiar it all feels. The humor of the medieval brothel was, in essence, no different than modern locker room banter, only accompanied by worse hygiene and more fleas. The women themselves were no strangers to the jokes. In fact, they were often the sharpest tongues in the room. Survival required wit as much as looks, and a cutting joke could deflate a client's ego faster than a fist. A woman might roll her eyes at a man's drunken boasting and say, "If your purse is as small as your codpiece, best keep it shut." Another might serenade a man with a bawdy tune of her own, mocking his clumsy advances while the other women howled with laughter. Humor gave them power, a moment of control in a world that constantly sought to strip it away. The men, of course, joined in the ribaldry with gusto. They sang dirty ballads at the top of their lungs, slurred with ale but enthusiastic enough to shake the rafters. These songs were never written down in illuminated manuscripts, but they lived in the air of the brothel, passed from mouth to mouth, like the diseases they carried. Some were parodies of courtly love songs, twisting tales of noble devotion into tales of drunken couplings in pigsties. Others were outright obscene, too graphic to be repeated outside the smoky confines of the house. But in those walls, the bawdier the better. Slang gave the place its own language, a dialect of lust that outsiders might not even understand. Body parts were renamed with animal comparisons, agricultural tools, or religious mockery. A penis might be called a holy relic, a woman's body, a chapel, her legs, the church doors. Every metaphor was a wink, a joke, a way of laughing at desire even as it consumed everyone present. The slang was shared between classes too. A knight and a peasant could understand each other in this crude vernacular better than they ever could in Latin. Lust had its own universal vocabulary, but the laughter wasn't only about filth, it was a shield. The brothel was a place of danger, disease, and exploitation, and without humor, the weight of it might have been unbearable. Jokes made it survivable. When a man's coin ran out and he was tossed into the street, the women laughed about his short visit. When a fight broke out and ended with someone limping home, the crowd turned it into a story told with exaggerated gestures and punchlines. Even pain became material, because turning it into comedy robbed it of some of its sting. The songs and jokes were also community glue. They created a shared experience, something everyone in the room could participate in regardless of status or wealth. A dirty ballad could make a noble laugh alongside a peasant, their voices joining in a chorus that drowned out, for a brief moment, the gulf between them. It was fleeting, but it mattered. In a world carved up by class and religion, the brothel's humor was one of the few things that leveled the field. Everyone was ridiculous here. Everyone was the butt of the joke. Of course, the church hated it. Priests warned against bawdy songs as gateways to sin. Sermons thundered about ungodly laughter and wicked tongues. But outside the pulpit, those same men chuckled along, repeating the jokes they pretended to despise. Sinful or not, humor was irresistible. It traveled beyond the brothel, spilling into taverns, markets, and homes. A reminder that laughter was stronger than shame. The walls of the brothel remembered it all. The echoes of songs, the sharp retorts of women mocking men, the howls of laughter when someone fell off a bench mid-verse. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't noble, and it wasn't written down in any poet's songbook, but it was alive. And maybe that's why the humor endures, because it was honest, raw, and human in a way courtly poetry never was. So forget the idea of solemn faces and whispered passion. Inside a medieval brothel, sex and laughter came as a pair, tangled together in songs that mocked, slang that teased, and jokes that still make sense centuries later. Life was filthy, painful, and short, but at least everyone knew how to laugh about it. Every city had them, and every city pretended not to. The brothels that weren't just houses of vice but landmarks in their own right, infamous enough that their names spread beyond the alleys and into the courts of kings, in London, Paris, Florence. Centers of trade and power, as well as hypocrisy. The most notorious establishments became legends, whispered about by men who had visited and gossiped about by those who hadn't. They were more than places to buy pleasure. They were stages where scandal played out, where politics and sex intertwined, and where even the highest in the land could be exposed as customers. London's Southwark district was the capital of sin long before the theatres made it famous. On the southern bank of the Thames, just far enough from the city of London to be outside its strict jurisdiction, the stews lined the waterfront. These weren't quaint cottages. They were brothels with signs swinging above their doors, painted symbols of animals or flowers. Since many patrons couldn't read, everyone knew what they meant. Here, prostitutes worked under regulations supposedly enforced by the Bishop of Winchester himself, which is why the women earned the nickname Winchester geese. Yes, The same church that thundered against lust also licensed and profited from it. The irony was so thick it practically oozed into the river. And when the scandals emerged, when priests were caught in beds they had condemned from pulpits, no one was truly surprised. Paris had its own tales, where the maisons de tolérance operated in neighborhoods that became shorthand for vice. One of the most infamous stood near the Rue du Temple, a house that welcomed everyone from weary merchants to cloaked nobles. Rumors swirled that princes themselves had been spotted slipping through its doors, disguised in plain cloaks but giving themselves away with the way they carried their purses heavy with gold. Writers of the time immortalized these brothels in satire, mocking the hypocrisy of the French court, where men toasted chivalry in public and then staggered into alleyways to buy what they swore was beneath them. The scandals were constant, but they never closed the houses. Paris needed its brothels as much as London did, and so they flourished, notorious and untouchable. Florence, for all its Renaissance grandeur, was no different. Behind its marble facades and frescoed chapels lurked some of the busiest brothels in Europe. The city's leaders tried repeatedly to ban prostitution, but the bans never lasted. Too many men in too many powerful families relied on the trade, and too much money flowed from the houses into city coffers. The scandals reached their peak when members of the clergy were found frequenting the very brothels they had sworn to cleanse. Bishops were denounced for keeping mistresses, monks whispered about for their visits, and yet the outrage never truly stuck. The men confessed, the women were punished, and life went on. What might have been enough to destroy reputations in another age became little more than fuel for gossip in Florence, because everyone knew the truth already. The political intrigue tied to these places was constant. Brothels weren't just spaces for sex. They were hubs of information, places where secrets spilled out as easily as ale. Men confessed things in bed they would never admit in council chambers. Merchants talked of shady deals, knights of military campaigns, clerics of rivalries within the church. Women heard it all and sometimes sold that knowledge, slipping tidbits to rivals or blackmailing patrons outright. A madam could wield more political influence than a city alderman if she kept her ears open and her books discreet. More than one scandal began not in a palace, but in a brothel bed where a careless word toppled careers. Kings themselves were not immune to exposure. Edward III of England was rumored to have enjoyed the company of Southwark's women, despite his proclamations about morality. Charles VI of France, in his bouts of madness, was whispered to have been escorted to brothels by his attendants in desperate attempts to calm him. In Italy, Medici rivals accused each other of maintaining houses of shame, weaponizing sex scandals as political cudgels. For every moral edict, there was a corresponding whisper about the ruler who had broken it. Power and hypocrisy walked hand in hand, and the brothel stood in the middle, smiling, profiting, and holding the receipts. When bishops were caught, the spectacle was even greater. These were men who thundered about sin from pulpits, who issued decrees about modesty and chastity, yet who slipped into brothels under the cover of night. The exposure of such men rarely led to their downfall. Often, it only deepened the church's coffers, as fines and penances were levied in exchange for forgiveness. The women, of course, bore the heavier burden, beaten, shamed, or exiled, while the men confessed, paid, and returned to their pulpits. Still, the scandals lingered in the streets, passed from mouth to mouth, proof that no sermon could erase the stink of hypocrisy. And yet, these famous brothels endured precisely because of scandal. Their notoriety drew clients as much as it repelled them. Men wanted to say they had visited the same house as a king, or lay in the same bed as a bishop, or drank at the same table where nobles had once sung bawdy songs. Infamy was its own advertisement. A brothel in Southwark or Paris could charge higher prices simply because it was talked about, because its name had entered the gossip of taverns and markets. Sin, once again, proved not only taxable but marketable. The reality of these places was no different from any other brothel. Straw mattresses, foul smells, diseases lurking in every embrace, but their reputations turned them into something larger than life. They were symbols of a society that shouted morality by day and bought pleasure by night, where kings and bishops could be found in the same rooms as cobblers and sailors. The scandals did not destroy them. They sustained them, feeding the myth that these brothels were not just dens of lust, but theaters of human weakness, where the powerful and the powerless alike were stripped of their masks. So when you hear of London's Winchester geese, or Paris's houses on Rue du Temple, or Florence's shadowed alleys, don't think of them as isolated dens of sin. Think of them as stages where hypocrisy was laid bare, where kings revealed themselves as men, and where bishops proved their sermons were little more than words. They were famous not despite the scandals, but because of them. And that is why their names, centuries later, still echo louder than the sermons that tried to erase them. Step into the streets of a medieval city, and you'll find the brothel not hiding in the shadows, but squatting in plain sight, tolerated and regulated like a market stall or a toll booth. Sin was not only acknowledged by the authorities, it was carefully organized, parceled, and, most importantly, taxed. For all the sermons railing against lust, city councils and bishops' courts were pragmatic. They knew men would keep visiting brothels no matter how loudly the church shouted, so they turned vice into revenue, pay your sin tax, or the gallows awaits. Licensing was the cornerstone of the system. In London, Paris, Florence, and countless smaller towns, brothels could operate legally as long as they paid for the privilege. Officials issued permits, often renewed annually, allowing madams to run their houses without fear of raids or closures. The logic was simple: regulate it, and you control it. At least, that was the theory. In reality, licensing was just another way for city treasuries to fatten their coffers. A brothel that handed over its dues could expect a blind eye from the watchman and a sympathetic shrug from magistrates. It was a bargain sealed not in morality, but in coin. The money wasn't insignificant. Taxes on brothels could equal or exceed those on guilds and trades, and city treasurers relied on them to fund repairs, festivals, even military defenses. In Southwark, the Bishop of Winchester himself licensed the stews, earning a tidy profit from women-branded Winchester geese. In some cities, revenues from prostitution went directly into the construction of churches and cathedrals, an irony so blatant it hardly needs commentary. The same walls that shook with the moans of clients at night indirectly supported the soaring spires where priests denounced lust by day. But the license was a leash as much as a shield. It meant surveillance, inspections, and endless opportunities for corruption. Officials might show up at a brothel demanding bribes on top of fees, threatening to shut it down for immorality unless their palms were greased. The very act of legalizing sin created a shadow market of extortion and hypocrisy. Everyone had a hand in the purse, from the lowliest bailiff to the bishop himself, and no one pretended it was anything other than business. For the women, the system was harsher. Licensed brothels operated with rules that stripped them of autonomy. Prostitutes were often required to wear distinctive clothing, striped cloaks, bells on their hoods, or special badges to mark them as public women. They couldn't wander the streets outside the designated brothel district, and they couldn't charge outside the madam's watch. Any attempt to work independently without the city's blessing meant harsh punishment. A woman caught plying her trade without a license could be fined, whipped through the streets, branded, or even banished. In some towns, repeat offenders were paraded in shame before the gallows as a warning, though the rope was usually spared unless the scandal grew too loud. The hypocrisy was staggering. City councils claimed they regulated brothels to protect morality, yet every coin collected went straight into civic budgets. Officials thundered against unlicensed prostitutes as corruptors of society, yet eagerly defended licensed ones because they paid their dues. The message was clear: Sin was tolerable, even useful, as long as the city got its cut. It wasn't about morality, it was about control. Some cities went further, embedding regulation into law codes that read like grotesque bureaucratic manuals for vice. Brothels were assigned specific districts, often near rivers, gates, or undesirable neighborhoods, segregated from respectable citizens. In Paris, prostitutes were confined to certain streets, barred from wearing fine clothes that might let them blend with honest women. In Florence, fines were levied against women who solicited outside approved areas, while the houses themselves were required to keep doors open during business hours so officials could conduct inspections. The entire system was designed to corral lust into sanctioned spaces, visible enough to be controlled, hidden enough to be denied. Yet enforcement was as selective as it was harsh. Wealthy men caught visiting unlicensed women were rarely punished, their status shielding them from shame. Poor women caught selling sex without a license, however, bore the full brunt of the law. Whipping, branding, exile. The punishments were tailored to terrify the most vulnerable into compliance, while leaving the powerful untouched. The gallows loomed in the background, rarely used but always present as a reminder. Obey the rules, pay your fees, stay in your place. Even when officials cracked down, their motives were usually financial rather than moral. If a brothel failed to pay its dues, suddenly it became a nest of corruption that needed cleansing. If a madam withheld her bribes, the watch swooped in with chains and fines. But as long as the money flowed, the houses stayed open, their doors swinging with the rhythm of commerce disguised as sin. This legal framework had broader cultural consequences. By regulating prostitution, cities effectively admitted that lust was ineradicable. No amount of sermons, no length of fasting, no parade of saints' relics could stop men from seeking brothels. Instead, the system wrapped that inevitability in bureaucracy and taxation. It institutionalized the contradiction. Vice was sin, but sin was profitable, and profit was holy enough when it kept streets paved and churches standing. The brothel laws also reinforced the stigma that clung to prostitutes for centuries. By branding them with clothing and restricting their movements, society declared them both necessary and untouchable. They were instruments of control, tolerated only when boxed into districts, punished if they tried to step outside. Their lives were not their own. They were commodities owned by the city as much as by the madam. Freedom meant breaking the law, and breaking the law meant pain. So picture it. A medieval prostitute, shuffling down a muddy street in her striped cloak, marked by law as both legal and damned. She has paid her dues, or rather her madam has, and so she is safe for now. But if she steps outside her lane, if she dares to keep a coin for herself instead of feeding the system, she risks the lash or the branding iron. The city doesn't care about her body or her soul. It cares about its revenue. That is the heart of regulation in the Middle Ages. Not morality, not compassion, not even control in the name of order. Just money, squeezed from sin as reliably as from trade, and wrapped in the threat of punishment sharp enough to keep the gears turning. Pay your sin tax, or the gallows awaits. The brothel was a trap for most women who entered, but some found ways to climb, if only by digging footholds into the very walls that caged them. For every girl forced into a life of servitude, there were a few who learned to play the game differently, who turned survival into strategy. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't common, but the medieval brothel did produce its rare success stories. Women who saved coins, built alliances, and bought their freedom one transaction at a time. The ladder upward was slim, shaky, and greased with danger, but it existed. The first strategy was simple but brutal: alliances. A prostitute alone in a brothel was prey to clients, pimps, and even fellow workers. But women who banded together could create small networks of protection. They shared food, pooled money, warned each other about violent men. Some forged bonds with madams, enduring their control in exchange for a degree of safety and opportunity. Others cultivated patrons, wealthy clients who offered steady support, gifts, or favors. To be chosen as a favorite could mean survival. A merchant might provide clothing, a nobleman might pay debts, a knight might intervene if trouble brewed. These arrangements were precarious, built on fragile promises, but they could turn the tide for a woman clever enough to keep multiple alliances alive. Saving money was harder. The cuts taken by madams, the taxes siphoned by cities, and the bribes demanded by guards left women with scraps. But some were disciplined, hiding away coins in cracks of floorboards or burying them in jars beneath brothel yards. A few managed to squirrel away enough to buy better clothes, small luxuries that drew wealthier clients. Others dreamed bigger, saving for the day they could buy freedom outright. Stories survive of women who accumulated enough to leave the brothel behind, purchasing homes, opening taverns, or even becoming madams themselves. Each coin saved was an act of rebellion, a declaration that their lives did not belong entirely to others. Buying freedom was the rarest but most dramatic strategy. A woman who could pay off her debts to the madam, bribe officials to erase her name from records, and secure lodging elsewhere might step out of the brothel's shadow entirely. Sometimes this meant marrying a client who had grown attached, though marriage to a former prostitute carried enormous stigma. Sometimes it meant vanishing into another city with coins hidden under skirts. And sometimes it meant embracing the system itself, using the knowledge, money, and connections gained in the brothel to rise as a madam, wielding the same power that once crushed her. Survival turned into control, and control turned into wealth. There were famous examples. In Paris, records tell of women who amassed fortunes, running houses sanctioned by the city, their names whispered with both envy and scorn. In Florence, a handful of former prostitutes owned property outright, their businesses too profitable for officials to ignore. In London, some of the Winchester geese climbed to positions where they managed others, their reputations blackened in sermons, but their purses heavy. These women never escaped the stain of their origins, but they carved out influence in a world that had no place for them otherwise. They became power brokers, negotiating with city officials, bribing guards, even influencing politics through the men who came to their doors. But for every success, there were 100 failures. Most women never had the chance to save enough, or died before they could. Violence, disease, and poverty swallowed them before escape was possible. The ladder was narrow, and the rungs were broken, and climbing it demanded both cunning and relentless luck. The women who made it weren't just clever, they were survivors in the truest sense, enduring long enough to flip the system to their advantage. Even for those who never escaped, strategies existed to make the brothel more bearable. Humor was a weapon, wielded to mock clients and deflate their arrogance. Gossip was currency, traded for favors or protection. Appearance was an asset, carefully maintained with herbs, powders, and bright clothing to stand out in the crowd. Some women leaned into roles, flirtatious, maternal, dangerous, shaping themselves into characters that clients returned for again and again. Performance became survival, and survival meant one more night of food, one more chance to save a coin. The alliances weren't limited to clients or fellow workers. Some women cultivated relationships with local officials, bribing guards to look the other way or feeding them information in exchange for protection. Others forged ties with priests, not for morality but for absolution, ensuring their reputations could be salvaged if they ever left. A clever woman knew that power was not just about money. It was about who you could call upon when danger closed in, who owed you favors, who wanted to keep your secrets. The irony was cruel. Women in brothels were vilified as sinners, yet they often had sharper political instincts than the men who condemned them. They navigated corruption daily, balanced debts against favors, and understood better than most how power flowed through a city. Some turned that knowledge into genuine influence, even if history tried to erase their names. They weren't just survivors. They were strategists, entrepreneurs, even quiet revolutionaries. Still, the weight of stigma never lifted. A woman who bought her freedom might run a tavern or own property, but whispers followed her. A former prostitute could be wealthy, respected in practice if not in name, but she could never scrub away the stain of where she had come from. The church would not forget. The neighbors would not forget. Society allowed her to rise, but never let her forget she had climbed out of the gutter. And yet, some did rise. Some became wealthy enough to dictate terms, to command respect, to live lives that would have been impossible without the brothel. Their survival strategies were testimony to the resilience of women in a system designed to crush them. They found cracks in the walls, and through those cracks, they carved paths upward. The ladder was slim, dangerous, and often fatal, but it was there. And for the few who climbed it, the brothel that had once imprisoned them became the very tool of their liberation. Marriage in the Middle Ages was supposed to be holy, a bond blessed by the church, sealed before God, and sanctified by the act of procreation. The reality was something less poetic: arranged contracts, dowries negotiated like livestock sales, and beds that often went cold from indifference, resentment, or sheer exhaustion. For many men, the comparison between a wife's bed and a brothel bed was brutally simple. One came with duties, expectations, and the constant watchful eye of kin and clergy. The other came with anonymity, indulgence, and the freedom to leave when the candles guttered out. And often, the second was cheaper. A wife's bed was supposed to be a place of order, sanctioned by law and faith. A space where lust was tolerated only if it led to children. Priests preached that the marital bed existed not for pleasure but for duty, that husbands and wives must render the marriage debt when asked, regardless of desire. Romance, if it existed at all, was accidental. For many women, sex within marriage was obligation. For many men, it was routine. Add to that the economic burdens: a dowry to be maintained, children to be fed, fields to be tilled, and the wife's bed became a reminder of responsibility rather than escape. The brothel bed, on the other hand, offered no responsibility. A man could stumble in with a few coins, spend an hour or a night, and walk away without worry about dowries, inheritances, or pregnancies that would tie him down. It was transactional, yes, but that was its appeal. There was no need to woo, no need to court, no need to endure the disapproving glances of in-laws or the scrutiny of neighbors. It was pleasure stripped of consequence, or at least of the social kind. Disease might linger in the sheets, but shame could be left at the door, disguised by candle smoke and drowned in ale. For poorer men, marriage itself was often out of reach. Without land, without money for a dowry, they couldn't hope to secure a wife. Brothels became their only access to sex, their only chance at intimacy, however hollow. For wealthier men, brothels offered a freedom marriage could not. A wife was bound by law and custom to remain faithful, but a husband was rarely punished for straying. Society turned a blind eye, sometimes even encouraged it, so long as he fulfilled his duties at home. The double standard was glaring. A wife caught outside her bed could face humiliation, divorce, or death. A husband caught in a brothel might earn a laugh from his peers and a nod from the officials collecting taxes on the very act. The contrast between the two beds carried deep implications for gender power. A wife was tethered, her sexuality bound by law, religion, and family. A prostitute, though exploited and stigmatized, represented a kind of alternative, a space where men could indulge without restraint. Both women bore the burden of male desire, but only one carried the social chains of respectability. A wife's body belonged to her husband by contract. A prostitute's body belonged to him for as long as his coin lasted. Either way, the control rested in his hands. And yet, the brothel bed was not truly liberating for men either. It was an illusion of freedom, bought in dimly lit rooms that never challenged the deeper system. A man could laugh and sing while tossing coins on a table, but at dawn he returned to the same responsibilities, the same marriage contracts, the same church that condemned him even as it profited from his visit. The brothel offered escape, but never liberation. It was a release valve, not a revolution, and society knew it. By tolerating brothels, cities preserved marriages, not by strengthening them, but by giving men an outlet that kept their frustrations from boiling over at home. For the women, the comparison was bitter. A wife lived with permanence, tethered to one man, enduring childbirth after childbirth until death relieved her. A prostitute endured many men, transient and anonymous, her body a revolving door of lust and coin. Neither role offered freedom, but the brothel at least held the faint possibility of strategy, saving money, making alliances, buying a way out. Marriage rarely did. A wife's survival was bound to her husband's fortune or misfortune, his loyalty or cruelty. A prostitute's survival was bound to the coins she scraped from strangers. The difference was not in power, but in the kind of cage each woman inhabited. Men joked about it openly. Tavern talk was filled with comparisons, crude and cruel. A wife's bed was cold bread, the brothel's bed, fresh meat. The metaphors were blunt, but they revealed the truth. Marriage was duty, the brothel indulgence. One was permanent, the other fleeting, but both were integral to a system that kept women's bodies under male control. A man might sneer at his wife's nagging and then boast of a prostitute's attentions, never seeing the irony that both women were trapped in roles defined by his choices. The church thundered against brothels while preaching the sanctity of marriage, but even priests knew the system was built on contradiction. The existence of licensed brothels allowed men to remain husbands without breaking society apart. It allowed wives to remain pure by displacing their husband's lust elsewhere. It was a compromise written not in scripture but in pragmatism, a social contract that propped up the institution of marriage by quietly tolerating its betrayal. What it revealed most clearly was how little choice women had in either bed. Marriage and prostitution were opposite sides of the same coin, bound by male authority and economic necessity. A wife might have her husband's name and household. A prostitute might have coins hidden in her bodice, but neither could fully claim her own body as hers. The brothel bed might seem freer because it was temporary, but it was just as controlled, just as transactional, just as hollow. So, when you picture the two beds side by side, the wife's draped in linens and sanctified by vows, and the brothel's sagging under filthy straw and shadowed by candlelight, remember that both told the same story. They were not symbols of different worlds, but of the same world, one that measured women's worth through men's use. To the men, the brothel seemed like freedom, the wife like duty. To the women, both were cages built by the same hands, and that is the cruelest comparison of all. When the Black Death came, it did not knock politely on the city gates. It seeped in like smoke, invisible and unstoppable, carried by fleas and rats, by ships and merchants, by the very arteries of trade that had made medieval cities so rich. Within weeks, streets that once roared with tavern laughter and church bells were silent, except for the rattle of death carts. And in those same streets, brothels, always noisy, always alive with smoke and ribald songs, suddenly became morgues. Straw mattresses lay empty, not because men lost their lust, but because they lost their lives. At first, the brothels tried to keep going. They always had. Plagues came and went, smaller outbreaks that claimed neighbors but never stopped the business. A man drunk enough would still stumble into a brothel even if the bells tolled for funerals nearby. The madams, pragmatic as ever, ordered vinegar rinses, hung herbs from doorways, and burned incense thick enough to choke, hoping to ward off the invisible killer. But when the Black Death struck in the mid-14th century, it was too vast, too merciless, too fast. Entire houses emptied overnight. Women who had laughed and sung at the hearth one evening were corpses by dawn. Clients who boasted in smoky rooms on Saturday were in the graveyard Sunday, hastily covered with lime. The church wasted no time pointing fingers. Prostitutes were easy scapegoats, their bodies already branded with sin in the public imagination. Priests thundered from pulpits that God's wrath had descended because of brothels, that the plague was punishment for lust and immorality. Pamphlets, sermons, and whispered gossip spread the same story. Who else but the whores had angered heaven so badly? Never mind that the disease spared no one. Nobles, bishops, children, monks, all died alike, blackened and swollen. Still, the stigma clung to the brothels like soot, and when officials looked for someone to blame, the women became convenient targets. Brothels were shuttered, sometimes by decree, sometimes because there was no one left to run them. In Florence, officials declared prostitutes must leave the city, lest their sin infect what the plague had not already claimed. In Paris, houses of pleasure were raided, their doors nailed shut as though wood and iron could keep pestilence at bay. In London, the stews of Southwark went quiet, their signs swaying over deserted streets, while death carts clattered past. Some women tried to flee to the countryside, but peasants barred their doors, terrified that lust itself carried the plague. Better to let the sinful die in the cities than risk contamination in the fields. The irony, of course, was brutal. The plague didn't care who you were or what you did. It didn't spare virgins or punish prostitutes. It killed indiscriminately, an equalizer far more ruthless than any sermon. But society needed a story, a reason, a culprit, and so sex work, already weighed down by stigma, bore yet another burden. The very same men who had once paid for these women now spat at them in the streets, called them witches, carriers of pestilence, vessels of God's anger. Hypocrisy had always been part of the brothel, but now it turned deadly. For the women inside, the plague was both horror and strange opportunity. Some died, abandoned by clients and madams alike. Others, if they survived, found that the emptying of cities left gaps even in the brothel trade. Where 10 women had once competed for a handful of coins, now one survivor could command higher pay. Widowed men, starved of both affection and companionship, returned to the houses as soon as fear ebbed. But this was a grim kind of triumph. Survival bought at the cost of watching friends and rivals buried in mass pits. The laughter that returned to the rooms was hollow, haunted by memories of silence. Officials oscillated between condemnation and regulation. In some places, once the worst of the plague had passed, brothels were quietly relicensed. The revenue was too tempting to ignore, and cities needed money desperately after years of death and economic collapse. In other places, bans lingered, fueled by paranoia that sin had caused the plague in the first place. The result was uneven, a patchwork of tolerance and persecution that mirrored the chaos of the time. But no amount of shutting doors or punishing women changed the reality. The Black Death did not care about laws, or licenses, or sermons. It killed madams and magistrates alike, toppled bishops and beggars, stripped noble halls as bare as brothel beds. The disease mocked every human attempt at order, sweeping through alleys and palaces with equal fury. When people looked for blame, they looked down at the women in striped cloaks. When death looked for victims, it looked everywhere. The decline of brothels during the plague years was not just about morality. It was about fear, the kind of fear that made neighbors turn on one another, that made cities wall themselves off, that made scapegoats out of the already marginalized. Prostitutes became symbols of contagion, though in truth they were no more dangerous than any merchant handling grain sacks or sailor unloading a ship. But symbols were enough. People needed to believe they could control the uncontrollable, and shutting down brothels felt like an act of purification, even if it did nothing at all. And yet, when the plague receded, the brothels returned. They always did. Human desire, unlike the plague, never died. Cities rebuilt, trade resumed, marriages were made and broken, and the houses of sin reopened their doors. The laughter, the songs, the stink of sweat, it all came back, layered atop the memory of silence and death. The brothel survived not because it was immune to plague, but because it was immune to morality. Lust was as permanent as hunger, as resilient as greed. The plague had shuttered the houses, stripped them of women and men alike, and stamped them with the mark of divine punishment. But it had not erased them. The truth was too simple for anyone to admit in the moment. Plague didn't care. It didn't come for sin, or lust, or brothels. It came for everyone. And when it passed, when cities dragged themselves back from the edge, the brothels rose with them, battered but inevitable, standing once more at the crossroads of hypocrisy and desire. Because even in a world haunted by death, people still sought the comfort of flesh, and no sermon, no scapegoat, no plague could stop that. The brothel had always lived in the cracks of society, tolerated by the authorities who taxed it and condemned by the preachers who secretly frequented it. But by the end of the Middle Ages, something shifted. The old contradictions that had let the business thrive began to close in, as reformers raised their voices and Renaissance morality tightened its grip. Slowly, unevenly, the glow of the medieval brothel dimmed. The laughter of dice games, the clatter of tankards, the bawdy songs that once spilled into alleys. These sounds began to fade, muffled by laws, sermons, and a new obsession with order. The Renaissance is remembered for art, for humanism, for the rediscovery of antiquity. But alongside frescoes and philosophy came a renewed desire to purify society, to root out the messiness of medieval life and replace it with discipline. Prostitution, once tolerated as a necessary evil, became a target. Reformers argued that brothels did not contain lust, as cities had once claimed, but inflamed it. They corrupted not only men, but the very moral fiber of society. And so the same cities that had built cathedrals with brothel taxes now began shutting their doors, stripping away licenses, and driving the women out. London's Southwark stews, famous for centuries under the patronage of the Bishop of Winchester, were officially suppressed by Henry VIII in the mid-16th century. The pretext was plague, morality, and the king's own reforming zeal, but the reality was more complex. Shifts in religious climate. Protestant fervor, Catholic backlash, the constant war of reform, made public toleration of vice harder to defend. The signs above brothel doors were torn down, the women evicted, the houses closed. Officially, the district was cleansed. Unofficially, nothing stopped men from finding women in taverns, alleys, or unlicensed rooms. The business simply slipped underground, where the city could pretend it no longer existed. Paris, too, turned on its brothels. By the late 15th century, the French crown banned them outright, closing the houses that had once been tolerated and taxed. Reformers insisted that prostitutes were not a necessary outlet but a plague on society, spreading disease and moral decay. The closures were framed as acts of purification, attempts to restore civic order and godliness. But again, the closures didn't erase demand. They merely scattered the women into clandestine networks, hidden houses, and street corners, where conditions grew harsher and protections fewer. Public morality triumphed in appearance, while private vice carried on in shadow. Florence, always a city of contradictions, oscillated between tolerance and suppression. The same city that birthed humanism also birthed Savonarola, the fiery preacher whose bonfire of the vanities railed against lust, art, and indulgence alike. Under his influence, prostitutes were expelled, their homes shuttered, their lives uprooted. The Florentines claimed to be cleansing their streets of corruption, even as men slipped into back rooms to seek the very pleasures they pretended to renounce. The cycle repeated across Europe. Suppression, scattering, underground survival, and eventual re-emergence. For the women themselves, the end of the brothel era was not liberation but further precarity. The licensed houses, as exploitative as they had been, at least offered a measure of structure. Regular clients, some shelter, and a madam who, if cruel, still had an interest in keeping her workers alive. With closures came vulnerability. Women were cast out into streets and alleys, left to fend for themselves in harsher conditions, with fewer protections and greater risks of violence. The brothel, for all its horrors, had been a cage. But when that cage was broken, the world outside proved no safer. The irony of reform was that it claimed to protect morality, but often made life more dangerous. Clergy declared that prostitution had been wiped away, while everyone knew it had simply gone underground. Laws proclaimed victory over vice, while women were beaten or starved in the shadows. Officials boasted of clean cities, while the same old business carried on in secret, hidden from view but no less present. Respectability demanded silence, and silence drove sex work deeper into invisibility. The end of the medieval brothel wasn't a clean break. It was a long, slow fading, uneven, across time and place. Some houses limped on, tolerated quietly, even as reformers thundered against them. Others were destroyed in purges, their names erased from city rolls. But the pattern was clear. What had once been an accepted, regulated part of urban life was being pushed out of sight, branded not as a necessary evil, but as an unacceptable one. The Renaissance wanted order, cleanliness, discipline, and brothels, with their noise, filth, and open defiance of marital ideals, no longer fit the picture. And yet, the brothel never truly died. It transformed. What had been licensed became illicit. What had been public became private. What had been taxed became criminalized. The women remained because demand remained, because lust remained, because no reform, however fervent, could extinguish what burned at the core of human nature. The difference was that now the women lived more precariously than before, hunted by officials, shamed more harshly by society, and denied even the thin protections the medieval system had grudgingly allowed. So, when the end of the night came for the medieval brothel, it wasn't a triumphant cleansing, nor was it a final curtain. It was a dimming of lights, a shuttering of doors, a dispersal into alleys and shadows. Reformers declared victory, cities proclaimed purity, and the church congratulated itself on its newfound rigor. But beneath the surface, the same transactions continued, more dangerous and desperate than ever. The brothel, in its medieval form, was gone. What remained was the proof that hypocrisy was as enduring as lust. The night didn't truly end. It just moved underground, where the candles still guttered, the dice still rattled, and the same stories carried on, whispered in darker rooms than before. Looking back across the centuries, it is tempting to treat the medieval brothel as some grotesque curiosity, something so filthy, so brutal, so absurd, that it feels like a carnival sideshow. But the truth is that it wasn't a sideshow at all. It was part of the main stage of life, woven into the economy, tolerated by the church, relied upon by men from every class, and endured by the women who lived inside its walls. To step into one now, with our modern eyes, would feel like walking into a nightmare of smells, violence, and desperation. And yet for them, it was simply Tuesday. The contrast with today is almost obscene. In the medieval brothel, you lay down on straw that hadn't been changed in years, inhaled air thick with piss and smoke, and hoped you didn't wake up itching. Or worse, coughing up blood in a few weeks. Today, at least, you have clean sheets, antibiotics, and Tinder. Swipe left, swipe right, and within minutes, you can line up a night's companionship without ever stepping into a room with lice leaping off the walls. The medieval equivalent of dating apps was yelling through the smoky haze at a madam, bargaining for half an hour in a corner curtained by a moth-eaten cloth. We have sanitized sex work in the literal sense, and in many places attempted to regulate it with laws and protections that would have seemed unimaginable to those medieval women. Medical checks, condoms, advocacy groups, all are imperfect, often contested, but they exist. In the Middle Ages, your only medical check was whether your skin still had some patches of pink left on it, and the only protection was a prayer muttered to a saint as you reached for vinegar. Today's society still stigmatizes sex work, often harshly, but at least we acknowledge the concept of consent, of safety, of bodily autonomy. For the women of medieval brothels, consent was a luxury word, and safety a joke. And yet, for all our progress, the echoes remain. Exploitation still exists. Stigma still clings. Hypocrisy still thrives in the gap between public morality and private desire. The same double standard that excused medieval husbands while condemning medieval wives hasn't vanished. It's just shifted costumes. The same laws that once licensed women to pay taxes now criminalize them in ways that keep them vulnerable. The same impulse that drove preachers to sermonize in the morning and sneak into brothels at night still drives modern scandals, whispered behind microphones instead of flickering candles. The medieval brothel may be gone, but its shadow stretches long. It's important to remember that the women inside those places weren't caricatures. They weren't just the Winchester geese or the nameless public women scrawled in court records. They were real people, born into hunger, poverty, or abandonment, and faced with choices so narrow they hardly deserved the word. Some endured violence, some strategized, saving coin in the cracks of floorboards to buy a better future. Some sang bawdy songs to make the night easier, laughed at drunkards to mask their own pain, or teased clients to gain some small power over them. They weren't saints or demons. They were human beings surviving in a system built against them. The men, too, were more complicated than the sermons and jokes suggest. They came from every class, carrying with them loneliness, frustration, and sometimes cruelty. Some were violent. Others were pitiful, seeking a kind of intimacy they couldn't find in marriage or life. They were hypocrites, yes, but they were also human, shaped by the same contradictions as the society that licensed their sins while condemning them in the next breath. The brothel exposed those contradictions with brutal clarity. The church needed the revenue, the city needed the outlet, and men needed somewhere to put the desires their culture told them to fear. From our vantage point, it is easy to recoil, to scoff at the filth, to laugh at the hypocrisy, to shudder at the diseases that carved through those beds. But to stop there is to miss the deeper truth, that these places were not alien or monstrous, just human, messy, desperate, cruel, yes, but human all the same. The people inside lived, suffered, joked, schemed, and loved in their own ways, just as people do now. Their world was darker, dirtier, and deadlier, but not incomprehensible. They too wanted to survive the night, to find laughter in the chaos, to cling to scraps of dignity in the face of exploitation. The medieval brothel was not a story of romance. It was a story of survival, of hypocrisy turned into law, of women navigating cages built by men in cities profiting from sin while pretending to abhor it. It was a theater of filth and humanity, where the worst and most ordinary impulses of human life played out in the flicker of candlelight. And when you look back from today, with your clean sheets, your antibiotics, your Tinder, and your illusions of progress, you realize how thin the distance really is. The buildings are gone. The straw mattresses have rotted. The songs have faded into silence. But the people who once lived inside them still matter. They were not just shadows in sermons or footnotes in tax rolls. They were human beings, surviving in the only ways they could. And if you strip away the centuries, the stink, and the hypocrisy, you see the truth that runs through every age, that even in the dirtiest corners of history, people laughed, schemed, endured, and tried to make it to morning. That is what survives. Not the brothel walls, not the hypocrisy of bishops or the cruelty of kings, but the humanity of those who lived inside, clinging to life one coin, one song, one desperate breath at a time.